The smell hit you first. Not bacon and eggs. This was 100,000 years ago, and breakfast meant checking if yesterday's kill had been stolen by hyenas. In a cave overlooking what would someday be Jerusalem, a Neanderthal mother named her children with sounds we'd never understand, calling them to eat organs that Whole Foods would never stock. She didn't know that just 50 miles south, skinny humans with weird round heads were doing something that would change everything. They were planning, not just tomorrow's hunt, but next week's, next month's. They were telling stories about hunts that hadn't happened yet, painting pictures with words about places they'd never been. This morning, like every morning for the past 1,000,000 years, 7 different species of humans woke up on the same planet. By the time your grandchildren reach your age, only one would remain, and it wouldn't be the strongest. The Neanderthal mother, let's call her Martha, because everyone needs a name, was built like an NFL linebacker who'd been compressed in a trash compactor, 5 feet tall, 180 pounds of twisted steel muscle. She could arm wrestle a chimp and win. Her breakfast routine hadn't changed in 200,000 years. Wake the kids, check the fire, scan for predators, portion out the meat. But this morning was different. Smoke rose from the southern hills where no smoke should be. Those weird, weak humans were back. The ones who threw their spears instead of getting close like real hunters. The ones who wasted time making those strange marks on rocks. The ones who buried their dead with flowers, as if flowers could feed anyone. Martha's kids didn't care about the strangers. They had their own problems, like fighting over who got the mammoth heart, the Pleistocene equivalent of the last piece of pizza. Her eldest, a boy of 12 who already stood 5'2" and could bench press a modern teenager, was more interested in the fact that Uncle Grok was making new spears. That was another thing about Neanderthals. They were the ultimate conservatives. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Their spear design hadn't changed since before America had horses. It worked. Why mess with success? Meanwhile, in those southern hills, a very different morning was unfolding. The Homo sapiens camp was chaos, but organized chaos. Where Martha's family worked in silent efficiency, these humans wouldn't shut up. They chattered constantly, pointed at things, made weird gestures with their hands. They were doing something no Neanderthal would waste energy on. They were teaching their children to imagine. One woman was showing her daughter how to mix ochre with animal fat, creating paint. Another was stringing shells into patterns that meant something. What? We'll never know. But meaning itself was the revolution. While Martha taught her kids which end of the spear was sharp, these humans were teaching their kids that things could represent other things. That this shell could mean, I love you, or I belong to the Eagle clan, or I survived the winter of the dying mammoths. It was breakfast time, 100,000 years ago, and humanity's future was being decided not by who had the biggest muscles or the sharpest teeth, but by who could imagine tomorrow differently than today. Grok's alarm clock had teeth. The cave bear's roar echoed through the limestone chambers where his family had slept for generations, same as every morning for the past 6 months. Most Americans would call animal control. Grok just grunted and reached for his thrusting spear, a weapon that required getting close enough to smell what your prey had for breakfast. By modern standards, Grok was built like a WWE wrestler who'd been fed nothing but elk meat and hostility since birth. 5'6", 200 pounds, with a chest that could deflect small aircraft. His morning routine would make CrossFit look like gentle yoga. Check the cave bear situation, maintain the fire that absolutely could not die. Scan for saber-toothed cats, and figure out what ungodly hour his teenage son had carved those new grooves in the cave wall. The grooves bothered him. Straight lines, repeated patterns. His son claimed they helped him remember where the good flint was. Grok thought this was nonsense. You remembered where the good flint was by remembering where the good flint was. Why complicate things? This younger generation with their fancy ideas. Next, they'd want to throw spears instead of stabbing properly like their fathers. But first, the bear. Grok grabbed a burning branch from the eternal fire. Eternal because if it died, so did they, and advanced toward the back of the cave. The bear, let's call him Bob, because even cave bears deserve dignity, was in his usual spot, having spent the winter hibernating in what Grok's family considered their spare bedroom. Every spring, same dance. Bob would wake up grumpy. Grok would suggest he find alternative accommodations. Bob would consider eating Grok's face. This morning, Bob chose discretion. Maybe it was the fire. Maybe it was recognizing Grok's "I haven't had my coffee because it won't be invented for 100,000 years" expression. The bear shambled past, giving Grok a look that clearly said, "We'll discuss this later," and exited through the cave mouth into the grey dawn. With the immediate bear situation resolved, Grok could focus on the day's actual challenges. First, the fire. Neanderthals didn't just use fire, they worshipped it, controlled it, lived and died by it. Keeping it alive was like maintaining a newborn baby, if that baby was the only thing standing between you and freezing to death while being eaten by hyenas. His wife, let's call her Marge, was already up, because Neanderthal women were the unsung heroes of the Pleistocene. While Grok was playing chicken with cave bears, she'd been planning the day's gathering expedition, checking the kids for injuries that needed attention, and maintaining the mental map of every edible plant within a day's walk. Their morning conversation went something like this, translated from Neanderthal. "Bears up early," Marge noted, sorting through her gathering baskets. Grok agreed, still watching the cave entrance. "Those skinny people are back. Saw their smoke yesterday." Grok said, but with a different inflection that meant he was paying attention. "Kids need new clothes. That auroch hide is almost ready." Grok acknowledged, already thinking about the hunt he'd need to organize. This was Neanderthal communication. Efficient, practical, no wasted words. They didn't need to discuss their feelings about the bear situation. The bear was handled. Move on. By the time the sun broke the horizon, the entire family was in motion. Neanderthal mornings weren't about ease or comfort. They were about momentum. Get moving before the cold set in. Get hunting before the herds moved. Get gathering before other families claimed the best spots. Get living before something killed you. And somewhere in the routine, between spear maintenance and fire tending, Grok's son kept making those marks on the wall. Strange, purposeless lines that would outlive them all. Kea woke up thinking about death. Not the dramatic, saber-toothed tiger eating your face kind of death. That was just Tuesday in the Pleistocene. No, she was thinking about her grandmother's death 6 moons ago, and the strange dream where grandmother had told her about a valley where the antelope never ran out and the water always ran clear. In a Neanderthal camp, dreams were just neurons misfiring during sleep. But in this Homo sapiens settlement in what would become South Africa, dreams were messages, stories, maps to places that might not exist but were worth looking for anyway. Kea was, by any objective measure, a genetic mistake. 5'3", 110 pounds soaking wet, with arms that couldn't bench press a modern laptop. Her skull was weird too, round like a basketball where every other human species had elegant football-shaped heads. If this were a high school, she'd be stuffed in a locker by the first passing Neanderthal. But Kea had something more dangerous than muscles. She had what her people called the far see, the ability to close her eyes and watch things that hadn't happened yet. This morning, she was watching her nephew's son, not yet born, walking in a valley she'd never seen, carrying a spear design that didn't exist. "You're doing it again," her sister Asha said, not unkindly. Asha was grinding ochre on a flat stone, creating powder the color of dried blood. "Grandmother's gone. The stories are just stories." But even as Asha said it, she was mixing the ochre with precise amounts of seal fat and crushed bone, a recipe their grandmother had taught them, which her grandmother had taught her, going back who knows how many generations. Stories might just be stories, but they were also technology transfer, disguised as entertainment. Their morning routine was chaos compared to their Neanderthal neighbors. Where Grok's family worked in efficient silence, Kaya's camp was a symphony of chatter. Everyone talked constantly, not just exchanging information, but creating it, weaving reality out of words. "I'm thinking," Kia announced to no one in particular, "about Grandmother's Valley." In a Neanderthal camp, this would be met with confused grunting. But here, 3 people immediately stopped what they were doing to listen. Because in sapien society, thinking out loud was a community sport. "The valley with the always antelope?" asked young Tico, who wasn't young by modern standards. At 15, he was middle-aged by Pleistocene metrics. She said it was past the 3 mountain teeth, where the sun sets in summer. Kaya was drawing in the dirt now, making marks that meant nothing and everything. "That's past Grok's territory," Asha pointed out, referencing their Neanderthal neighbors like suburbanites discussing the folks 2 houses down. "They don't like visitors." "But what if we didn't visit?" Kia said, and here was the revolutionary thinking that would doom every other human species. "What if we went around? What if we followed the coast? What if we took boats?" "Aha! Boats. Another impossible idea. Every other human species looked at water and saw a barrier. Homo sapiens looked at water and saw a highway. By mid-morning, the entire camp was infected with Kaya's grandmother's dream. They weren't planning to search for the valley today, or even this season, but they were adding it to their collective mental map. That shared hallucination of places they'd been, places they'd heard of, and places that might exist if you were brave enough to look. This was the sapiens' morning routine. Wake up, share dreams, turn dreams into plans, turn plans into stories, tell stories until they became real. They couldn't outfight a Neanderthal, couldn't out-survive Homo erectus, couldn't out-climb Denisovans, but they could out-imagine everyone. And in the end, that's all that mattered. At 14,000 feet above sea level, where modern humans would be gasping like goldfish on a sidewalk, Tenzin woke up breathing easy. Her lungs, powered by a genetic gift that wouldn't be understood for 100,000 years, processed the thin air like a New Yorker processing pizza, efficiently and without complaint. The Tibetan Plateau at dawn was a frozen hellscape that would make North Dakota winters look tropical. But for Tenzin's people, the ghost people, the ones who lived so high that even rumors about them were breathless, this was just another Thursday. She started her morning the way her kind had for generations, by checking if anyone had died in their sleep. At this altitude, with temperatures that could flash freeze exposed flesh in minutes, death was less a stalking predator and more a roommate who didn't pay rent, but everyone was still breathing, including her father, whose recent habit of coughing up blood suggested their time on this particular peak was coming to an end. The Denisovans were evolution's overachievers. Where Neanderthals adapted to cold and sapiens adapted to everything badly, Denisovans looked at Earth's most inhospitable environments and said, "Challenge accepted. Deserts, check. Tropical rainforests, no problem. Himalayan death zones. Hold my fermented yak milk." Tenzin herself was a testament to this adaptability. 6 feet tall, unusual for the era, with a barrel chest that housed lungs which could process oxygen like a Ferrari processes premium gasoline. Her mitochondrial DNA carried mutations that would one day make Sherpas famous, but for now just made her family the only humans who could live where clouds went to die. Her morning routine started with melting ice. Everything at this altitude started with melting ice. Ice for drinking, ice for cooking, ice for the endless tea-like beverage they made from local plants that kept their blood flowing despite the cold. The fire had been kept alive all night. Had to be, because starting a new one in air this thin was like trying to light matches underwater. Valley people are moving again, her brother Norbu announced, studying the lands below through the crystal-clear mountain air. His eyesight, enhanced by generations of high-altitude adaptation, could spot movement that would require binoculars today. The valley people were Homo erectus, still clinging to territories they'd held for 1,000,000 years. From up here, Tenzin's family could watch the drama of human competition play out like spectators at the world's slowest football game. Erectus moving north for summer hunting, sapiens probing east from Africa, Neanderthals holding their European strongholds, and somewhere out there, their own kind, other Denisovan groups adapted to other impossible places. They won't last, Tenzin's father wheezed, his high-altitude adaptations finally meeting their match in whatever disease was eating his lungs. Valley people never do. Too comfortable, too set in their ways. It was a harsh judgment from someone whose own people were about to face extinction, but he wasn't wrong. The Denisovans' greatest strength, extreme specialization, would also be their doom. You can adapt to live anywhere, but when anywhere starts changing faster than genes can keep up, you're in trouble. Breakfast was yak. It was always yak. Yak meat dried in the thin air. Yak butter tea that would make Starbucks customers riot. Yak hide clothes, yak bone tools, yak everything. Other human species diversified their diets. Denisovans in the mountains had achieved a perfect symbiosis with one animal and saw no reason to complicate things. I had the dream again, Norbu said quietly. The dream where people with round heads and weak bodies somehow climbed their mountains, carrying strange tools and speaking in tongues that sounded like birdsong. Dreams are brain waste, their father said, but Tenzin noticed he gripped his spear a little tighter. By mid-morning, they were ready to move. Not far. At this altitude, everything was measured in vertical feet, not horizontal miles. But the yaks needed new grazing, and the family needed to check their trap lines. Life at 14,000 feet wasn't about grand adventures. It was about tiny, calculated movements that kept you alive another day. As they packed up camp, Tenzin took one last look at the valleys below, where other human species scurried about their morning routines like ants at a picnic. Up here, they were untouchable. Up here, they were gods. Up here, they were running out of time. Budi stood 3 feet 6 inches in his best posture and was having the greatest morning of his extremely short life. He'd just invented something that would revolutionize hunting on Flores Island. He called it the pointy stick that flies straight. The rest of the world would eventually call it an arrow, but they were running about 20,000 years behind Budi's innovation curve. The problem with being a Homo floresiensis was that everything wanted to eat you, and you wanted to eat everything, but physics wasn't on your side. When you're the height of a modern first grader trying to hunt elephants, even dwarf elephants, you need to get creative. It'll never work, his sister Siti declared. She was the family pessimist, which in fairness was a survival trait when you shared an island with Komodo dragons that viewed you as a walking happy meal. Throwing sticks is stupid. Stabbing works fine. Stabbing works fine if you're tall enough to reach vital organs, Budi countered, demonstrating his new invention by launching a miniaturized arrow at a tree. It flew straight for about 6 feet before clattering to the ground. It just needs adjustments. Their morning routine on Flores was unlike anything elsewhere in the human world. Where other species woke up worrying about cave bears or saber-toothed cats, the hobbits of Flores had graduated to an entirely different level of weird. Their predators were dragons, actual, honest-to-evolution dragons that could smell carrion from 3 miles away and run faster than a middle-aged American fleeing a gym membership. But the hobbits had advantages too. Their small size meant they needed less food, crucial on an island where everything was portion-controlled by nature. Their brains, while smaller than other humans, were incredibly efficient. They'd figured out fire, tools, and cooperative hunting strategies that would make Navy SEALs jealous. "Dragon tracks by the water," their father announced, returning from his morning reconnaissance. At 4 feet tall, he was considered imposingly large by hobbit standards. Fresh. Maybe 6 hours. This was the daily calculus on Flores. Water was life, but water sources were where dragons waited. The hobbits had developed a sophisticated rotation system, hitting different water sources at unpredictable times, always sending scouts, always ready to scatter like pool balls if a dragon appeared. Breakfast was Stegodon, a dwarf elephant the size of a large pig that the hobbits had been hunting so successfully they were about to hunt them into extinction. Nobody knew this yet, of course. Environmental conservation wouldn't be invented for another 99,950 years. "We need to talk about the tall strangers," Siti said, spearing a chunk of Stegodon liver with a stick. Quan saw their fires on the big island again. The tall strangers were Homo sapiens, visible across the strait that separated Flores from the larger Indonesian islands. They'd been showing up more frequently, their fires dotting the coastline like a rash spreading across the archipelago. "They can't cross water," their father said confidently. "No one can cross water." This was hobbit conventional wisdom, based on the fact that they themselves had no idea how their ancestors had gotten to Flores in the first place. The island had been isolated for 1,000,000 years. The hobbits had been here for at least 50,000. The math didn't add up, but when you're focused on not being dragon food, you don't spend much time on theoretical physics. By mid-morning, the family was ready for the day's main activity, checking their trap lines. The hobbits had developed an ingenious system of pit traps and snares, sized perfectly for the island's miniature megafauna. It was like a deadly miniature golf course, but with dinner as the prize. "If the pointy flying stick works," Buddy mused as they walked, still fiddling with his invention, "we could hunt from trees. Dragons can't climb trees. Stegodons can't climb trees either." Siti pointed out. "How do you get the meat down?" "Details," Buddy said airily in the tone of innovators everywhere who haven't thought things through. As they reached the first trap, empty but showing signs of a near miss, none of them knew they were living in the last days of a paradise that had existed for millennia. That the tall stranger's fires meant more than just new neighbors. That Buddy's flying stick innovation had come 20,000 years too late to save them. But this morning, in their island paradise where dragons were the biggest worry and elephants came in fun-size portions, life was good. Life was weird, dangerous, and required constant vigilance against reptilian death machines, but it was good. And really, what more could a 3-foot-tall human ask for? If you laid out the tool collections of all 7 human species circa 100,000 years ago, it would look like a prehistoric episode of Antiques Roadshow, where everyone brought weapons instead of grandma's china. And just like that show, the real value wasn't in what things looked like, but in the stories they told. Grok the Neanderthal hefted his spear with the confidence of a man whose family had been making the same design since before glaciers were cool. The Levallois technique, their signature move, was like a Japanese tea ceremony with rocks. You didn't just bash stones together like some Homo erectus amateur. You prepared the core, visualized the final product, then remove flakes with the precision of a sushi chef filleting extinct fish. This spear, Grok would say if he had enough language for complex sentences, killed a cave bear, and its father, and its father's father. Same design. Why change? Meanwhile, 50 miles south, Kea the Sapiens was committing technological heresy. She'd taken a perfectly good spear and ruined it, by Neanderthal standards, by attaching strange additions. Microblades, tiny stone fragments hafted with tree resin mixed with ochre, a shaft that was too thin, too flexible, and most bizarre of all, feathers attached to the end. "It flies straighter," she explained to her band, who were used to Kea's weird ideas by now. "The spinning makes it... I don't have words for it, but it works." This was the thing about Homo sapiens technology. Half of it looked insane until it worked. They heat-treated stones before knapping them, essentially cooking rocks like they were preparing dinner. They mixed adhesives with the dedication of meth cooks, if meth kept you from freezing to death. Up in the Himalayas, Tenzin's Denisovan clan had taken a different approach. Their tools were brutalist architecture in stone, massive, functional, designed for one thing: processing frozen yak carcasses at altitudes where finesse was a luxury you couldn't afford. Their scrapers could double as weapons. Their weapons could double as hammers. Everything could double as everything, because when you live at 14,000 feet, redundancy is religion. "Pretty tools are for valley people," Tenzin's father would wheeze. "Tools that work when your fingers are frozen. That's civilization." On Flores, Budi had miniaturized everything. Hobbit tools looked like a child's playset until you realized they were perfectly scaled for hunting creatures that were themselves miniaturized. Their stone points were jewels of efficiency. Why waste material when you're only 3 feet tall and your prey is the size of a golden retriever? But the real technological revolution wasn't in the tools themselves. It was in what Kea's people did with ochre. While everyone else used the red pigment for practical purposes, hafting adhesive, sun protection, wound treatment, Sapiens were doing something unprecedented. They were making marks that meant things. "See this?" Kea showed her nephew 3 lines crossed by 2 lines. "This means good hunting here in spring. Anyone who sees this will know." "But we already know that," her nephew protested. "We won't always be here, but the marks will." The other species watched this behavior with the confusion of people seeing someone talk to their smartphone in 1920. Information storage outside the brain. Insanity. Knowledge was stored in neurons or not at all. Yet there were the Sapiens, making marks on rocks, on shells, on anything that would hold still long enough. Every species thought their technology was superior, and they were all right for their specific situation. But only one species was creating technology that could outlive its creators, speak to strangers, and travel without walking. Only one species had figured out how to make tools from ideas themselves. The mammoth herd moved across the frozen steppe like a mountain range that had decided to go for a walk. 43 individuals, from matriarch to newborn, following routes older than any human's memory. And watching from different vantage points, 4 different human hunting parties were having the same thought. That's a lot of meat. The Neanderthal strategy was straightforward as a linebacker's charge. Grok and his brothers had been watching this herd for weeks, noting the old bull who lingered at the edges, favoring his left front leg. Neanderthals were the snipers of the Pleistocene. They didn't chase herds off cliffs like those show-off sapiens. They got close, personal, close enough to smell the mammoth's last meal. Tomorrow, Grok decided, when he goes to the waterhole at dawn. The plan was elegantly brutal. 3 hunters would position themselves between the bull and the herd. 2 more would wait at the water. When the mammoth lowered his head to drink, a 10-ton animal momentarily balanced on 3 legs, they'd strike. Spears to the neck, The belly, anywhere, soft. Then it was just a matter of following the blood trail and hoping he died before leading them into saber-tooth territory. 2 valleys over, Kaya's Sapiens band was having a very different conversation. "We don't need to get close at all," she was explaining, drawing patterns in the dirt. "We push them here." She indicated a narrow canyon where Tico's group is waiting with fire. "The smoke drives them back to us. We funnel them toward the cliff. The earth does the killing." It was a plan that required 20 people, perfect timing, and the ability to predict how panicked mammoths would behave. It was also insane by Neanderthal standards. Why coordinate 20 people when 5 could do the job? Why waste all that meat when one mammoth could feed a band for weeks? "Because," Kaya said, though Grok would never hear her answer, 20 mammoth will feed 20 bands. And 20 bands owing you favors is worth more than meat. This was Sapiens thinking, turning a hunt into a political system. High above, Tenzin's Denisovan band watched both operations with the detached interest of people who had bigger problems. Mammoths rarely climbed above 10,000 feet, and when they did, the thin air made them sluggish, easy prey. The Denisovan's challenge wasn't killing mammoths. It was processing them before everything froze solid. "Valley people make things so complicated," Norbu observed, watching the elaborate Sapiens coordination through the clear mountain air. "Just wait for winter. Everything comes to you." This was true. Winter drove herds up the mountain valleys seeking shelter. The Denisovans had turned patience into a weapon. Why chase when you could wait? They dug pit traps in the narrow passes, invisible under snow. A mammoth would fall, break a leg, and freeze to death doing most of the preservation work for them. On Flores, Budi was having a different conversation entirely. "I still think we could hunt mammoth," he insisted. "There are no mammoths here," City reminded him for the 100th time. "But if there were, tiny ones, elephant-sized elephants. We already hunt elephant-sized elephants. They're called stegodons. But imagine mammoth-flavored ones." This was the Hobbit problem. Island life had given them everything scaled to their size. But stories from the mainland, how they heard these stories was a mystery lost to time, filled their dreams with impossible prey. By sunset, the Neanderthals had their bull, 6 tons of meat, hide, and ivory, taken down by 5 hunters who'd gotten close enough to count his eyelashes. One brother had a shattered shoulder from a trunk strike, but he'd live. The Sapiens had driven 3 mammoths off a cliff, losing 1 hunter to a fall and another to the subsequent stampede, but they had enough meat to trade, gift, and politic their way through winter. The Denisovans waited. The mammoths would come to them, as they always did when the snow deepened. Patience was just another form of intelligence. Each species hunting the same prey, revealing everything about how they saw the world. And only one species was already telling stories about the hunt that would outlive the hunters, the mammoths, and the world that made them both. Fire was the Netflix subscription of the Pleistocene. Technically, you could survive without it, but your quality of life would plummet so fast you'd be begging for death by day 3. Unlike Netflix, if your fire went out, you couldn't just restart it with a credit card and an apologetic email. The Neanderthal approach to fire was like their approach to everything. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, and if it breaks, you're probably dead. Grok's family had maintained the same hearth for 6 generations. The fire that warmed his children was lit from embers that had warmed his great-great-grandmother. They didn't think of it as keeping the fire alive. The fire was alive, a family member that ate wood and breathed smoke. Firekeeper wasn't a job in Neanderthal society. It was a sacred calling, usually an elder, past prime hunting age but with decades of experience reading the moods of flame. They knew which woods burned hot, which burned long, which created smoke that kept mosquitoes away or attracted prey. They could bank a fire to last 12 hours with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. But the sapiens were doing something that made Neanderthal firekeepers wake up in cold sweats. They were making new fires. Casually, like it was no big deal. Kaya demonstrated the technique to her nephew, spinning a pointed stick between her palms, the friction heating dried fungus until, impossibly, smoke appeared. Then a tiny ember. Then, with careful breath control that would make a yoga instructor proud, flame. "Anyone can do this?" her nephew asked, mind-blown. "Anyone who practices," Kaya confirmed. "Fire isn't sacred, it's technology." This was heresy to every other human species. Fire was received, maintained, protected, stolen, but created. That was God-level stuff. Yet here were these scrawny sapiens, making new fires whenever they felt like it, carrying fire-starting kits like prehistoric Boy Scouts. The implications were staggering. Neanderthal bands were tethered to their hearths like dogs to posts. Lose your fire in a blizzard. Better hope you could steal some from neighbors before freezing. But sapiens could range freely, knowing that fire was just some friction away. In the mountains, the Denisovans had taken fire technology in a different direction. At 14,000 feet, where oxygen was scarce and wood was scarcer, they'd learned to burn anything. Yak dung, compressed grass, even bones if properly prepared. Their hearths were marvels of efficiency, extracting every BTU from materials other humans wouldn't consider fuel. "Valley people waste fire," Tenzin's father would say, watching the excessive blazes in the lowlands. Big flames, no control. Like children playing. The Denisovan hearth was a precision instrument. Stone-lined chambers that channeled heat. Dampers made from flat rocks to control airflow. They could maintain cooking temperature for hours on a handful of dung, while Neanderthals burned whole trees for the same effect. On Flores, the hobbits had a different problem: too much fire. The tropical climate meant fire was less about warmth and more about keeping dragons at a respectful distance. They developed portable fire, wrapped coals in leaves that would smolder for hours, creating smoke screens for movement. "Fire should move with you?" Budi insisted, swinging his smoking leaf bundle like a prehistoric censer. "Not tie you to one place." But the real fire innovation was happening in sapiens camps, and it wasn't about making fire, it was about what they did with it. While other species use fire for warmth, cooking and protection, sapiens were using it for chemistry. They were heating stones to precise temperatures before napping, mixing ash with animal fats to create soap, using controlled burns to manage landscapes, encouraging the growth of useful plants. They were turning fire from a tool into a transformation engine. "Fire changes things," Kia explained to anyone who'd listen. "Not just cooks them, changes them, makes them new." This was the cognitive leap that separated sapiens from everyone else. Other species saw fire as fire. Sapiens saw fire as possibility. The war for fire wasn't fought with spears and clubs, it was fought with ideas. And the species that could create fire at will, that could imagine fire as more than heat and light, had already won. They just didn't know it yet. Location, location, location. The three rules of real estate applied just as much in 100,000 BCE as they do today. Except instead of good schools and low crime rates, you were looking for defensible from cave bears and won't flood during spring melt. The cave at Kafse was premium property. Southern exposure for winter warmth, elevated entrance to spot predators, freshwater spring just 50 yards away, and spacious enough for 3 families if they didn't mind getting cozy. It was the Paleolithic equivalent of a Manhattan penthouse, and everyone wanted it. Currently, Grok's Neanderthal clan held the lease. They'd muscled out a sapiens band 6 months ago in what anthropologists would later call a territorial dispute. But what was really just a good old-fashioned eviction notice served at spear point. The Neanderthals had been here since, making improvements, a stone windbreak at the entrance, designated areas for tool-making and butchering, even what passed for interior decorating in the form of cave bear skulls arranged in what might have been artistic, or might have just been storage. But this morning, Grok woke to find fresh human tracks outside. Not Neanderthal. The gait was wrong. The foot shape too narrow. Those weird sapiens were back, and they'd been scouting. "They wouldn't dare," his brother Thag grunted, examining the tracks. "We won fair. Cave law." Cave law was simple. Whoever could hold it, owned it. But sapiens didn't play by cave law. They played by what would eventually be called politics, but what was currently just being sneaky and social. Kaya's band hadn't come to fight. They'd come to negotiate, which was a concept as foreign to Neanderthals as cryptocurrency to a caveman. She approached under what would later be called a flag of truce, but was currently just holding no weapons and walking slowly. "Nice cave," she said in the broken Neanderthal sapiens pidgin that was developing wherever the species met. "Very nice. You do good things. We have proposition." Grok's first instinct was to throw a rock at her, but something in her manner, maybe the way she kept her hands visible, maybe the 2 other sapiens hanging back with what looked like trade goods, made him pause. "We no want share," he said firmly. Neanderthals didn't do roommates. "No share," Kia agreed quickly. "Trade. We know 3 caves, good caves. One has bear, but bear is old, dying soon. One near very good flint. One near ocean, many shells, many fish. We show you, you give us visiting rights." Visiting rights? This was a new concept. Sometimes we come, leave things, take things, not live, just visit, like family. The concept of extended family networks was giving Grok a headache. Neanderthal family was simple, your blood, your band. Everyone else was competition. But these sapiens seemed to have family scattered everywhere, connected by invisible threads of obligation and favor trading. Meanwhile, in the mountains, the Denisovans had solved the cave shortage differently. If good caves were rare, make more caves. They'd learned to modify marginal shelters, building walls from stacked stones, extending overhangs with wooden frameworks, essentially turning crack in the rock into livable spaces. "Waiting for perfect cave is waiting for death," Tenzin's father explained to his children. "Make what you have better." On Flores, the hobbits had the opposite problem. Too many good caves, not enough hobbits. Buddy's family could choose from dozens of premium shelters, their only concern being which ones were too close to dragon highways. "I think we should have 2 caves, Buddy suggested. Summer cave, winter cave, like vacation homes. "You want to maintain 2 fires?" City asked skeptically. "Clean 2 caves, defend 2 caves from dragons." "Details," Buddy said, which was becoming his response to all logical objections. Back at Kafza, negotiations were breaking down. Grok couldn't grasp why sapiens would want to visit a cave they didn't live in, store things in a cave they didn't own. It smelled like a trap, even if he couldn't figure out how. "We think about it," he said finally, which in Neanderthal meant, "Go away before I remember I'm stronger than you." Kaya left, but not before making eye contact with Grok's teenage son, who'd been watching the whole exchange with unusual interest. She saw something in his eyes that Grok couldn't. Curiosity about these strange people with their strange ideas. The cave real estate crisis wouldn't be solved with spears or strength. It would be solved by the next generation, who would learn that sometimes sharing space meant controlling more territory than any one family could hold. But Grok didn't know that. He just knew his cave was safe for another day. even as the world was changing around him faster than Neanderthal culture could adapt. Love in the Pleistocene was complicated enough without adding species boundaries to the mix. But 100,000 years ago, on a warm spring evening near what would become the Jordan River, two young humans from different evolutionary branches were about to make things exponentially more complex. Grok Jr., not his real name, but Neanderthal naming conventions don't translate well, was everything a Neanderthal maiden could want. Built like a prehistoric linebacker, could bench press a baby mammoth, and had successfully killed his first cave bear at 14. By Neanderthal standards, he was a catch. By Sapien standards, he was confusing as hell. Asha, Kaya's niece, because these stories are all connected, had come to the river to gather reeds for basket making. She was 17, which in Pleistocene years meant she should have been married with 3 kids already. But Asha had what her band called the wandering spirit, and what modern psychiatrists would call commitment issues. She saw him before he saw her. Neanderthals weren't big on stealth when they weren't hunting. Why sneak when you could intimidate? He was napping stones by the water, and Asha was struck by the precision of his movements. Brutal efficiency, yes, but also a kind of grace. Nice technique, she said, in the pidgin language that was developing between their peoples. Very traditional. Grok Jr. looked up, startled. Sapiens women didn't usually compliment Neanderthal toolmaking. Usually they made snide comments about doing things the old way, and have you considered innovation? It works, he said defensively. I didn't say it didn't. She moved closer, noting how he tensed but didn't retreat. Just that it's very you. This was peak Sapiens flirting, using words to say things that weren't quite insults but weren't quite compliments either. Neanderthals preferred more direct approaches like offering freshly killed meat or demonstrating feats of strength. You're the cave negotiator's niece, he said. It wasn't a question. Neanderthals had excellent memory for faces, compensation for their smaller social networks. And you're the one who watched the whole thing like you were actually interested. He grunted, which could mean anything in Neanderthal. In this case, it meant guilty as charged but admitting nothing. What followed was the world's most awkward cross-species courtship. Sapiens courtship involved gift-giving, symbolic exchanges, and endless talking. Neanderthal courtship involved proving you could provide and protect. Neither quite understood the other's signals. Grok Jr. brought her a freshly killed rabbit. Asha thanked him and immediately started telling a story about rabbits that was somehow about the moon. He brought her premium flint from a quarry 2 days' walk away. She made him a necklace from shells that supposedly meant something about eternal connection, but mainly just looked pretty. Your people are strange, he told her after 2 weeks of this. Your people are stubborn, she countered. Yes, they both agreed. The real challenges came from their families. Grok Sr. was apoplectic. Mixing with Sapiens? What next? Adopting their crazy fire-making ways? Their obsession with painting things? Their weird burial practices? She's not strong enough for our life, he argued. Sapiens women are weak, fragile, talk too much. Meanwhile, Kaya was having a similar conversation with her sister. Neanderthals are conservative, stuck in their ways. He'll never understand your need for innovation, for art, for meaning, beyond survival. But here's the thing about young love. It doesn't care about species boundaries. The couple met in secret, teaching each other their respective technologies. He showed her the Le Valois technique. She showed him how to make composite tools. He taught her to read weather patterns in cloud formations. She taught him to see patterns in the stars that could guide navigation. Your way isn't wrong, she told him one evening. Just different. Different usually means wrong, he said, but he was smiling, a rare expression for a Neanderthal. They weren't the only ones. Across Eurasia, wherever human species overlapped, young people were discovering that genetic boundaries were more like suggestions. The evidence would be written in DNA, every non-African human carrying traces of these prehistoric love affairs. In the mountains, a Denisovan woman was teaching a Neanderthal man to breathe at altitude. On the edges of sapiens expansion, couples were figuring out that tall and short, robust and gracile, innovative and traditional could find common ground. "What will our children be?" Asha asked one night. "Survivors," Grok Jr. answered, with more prescience than he knew. Because that's what they were creating. Children who would carry the best of both worlds. Neanderthal disease resistance, sapiens innovation, Denisovan environmental adaptation. Love was literally building the future human genome, one awkward cross-species date at a time. The dating game of 100,000 years ago wasn't just about finding a mate. It was about finding a future. And in the end, love would prove more powerful than any species boundary, even if it did make family dinners really, really awkward. Kaya's nephew Tico was about to accidentally invent the prehistoric equivalent of the atomic bomb. He didn't mean to. He was just tired of getting close enough to prey to smell their breakfast, and really tired of Uncle Grok Jr., now part of the extended family through that whole interspecies dating situation, laughing at Sapiens' weak throwing arms. The bent stick started as a joke. Tico had been trying to make a better spear thrower when the wood split. Instead of tossing it, he noticed how it flexed, how it wanted to snap back, how it stored energy like a coiled spring. His artist's brain, the same one that saw stories in stars, saw something else in that bent wood. What if, he muttered to himself, because talking to yourself was perfectly acceptable before society invented the concept of looking crazy. We let the wood do the throwing. 3 weeks later, after more failed attempts than a suburban dad assembling IKEA furniture, Tico had created humanity's first bow. It looked like something a child would make, because technically a teenager had made it. But when he knocked his first arrow, really just a straightened stick with a sharp rock tied to the end, and let it fly, he changed the nature of predation forever. The arrow flew 40 yards and buried itself in a tree trunk with a satisfying thunk. "That's impossible," Grok Jr. said flatly, having come to visit his Sapiens in-laws and immediately regretting it. Wood can't throw things. Arms throw things. The wood stores the power, Tico tried to explain, like how a bent branch wants to straighten, but controlled, directed. Grok Jr.'s Neanderthal brain, evolved for immediate practical problems, struggled with this abstraction. Energy storage, mechanical advantage. These concepts were as foreign as cryptocurrency to a caveman, which, technically, Grok Jr. was. But he couldn't argue with results. When Tico shot a rabbit at 30 yards, a distance that would require Olympic-level spear throwing, even Neanderthal stubbornness had to acknowledge reality. "This changes things," Grok Jr. said slowly. He had no idea how much. Within a month, every Sapiens in Kaya's band was practicing archery. Within a year, the technology had spread to 3 other bands through their extensive social networks. The Neanderthals watched with growing unease as their physical advantages, size, strength, close combat superiority, became irrelevant. "It's not natural," Grok Sr. complained, watching Sapiens children practice on targets. "Killing should be personal. You should look your prey in the eye, match your strength against theirs. This is cowardice." But Tenzin's Denisovan band, watching from their mountain perches, saw it differently. Norbu had immediately grasped the implications when traders brought news of the innovation. "Distance is safety," he told his father. "Safety is survival. These Sapiens understand something we don't." The Denisovans began experimenting with their own versions, adapted for high altitude where wood was scarce. Composite bows made from horn and sinew, shorter but more powerful. They couldn't match Sapiens' innovation speed, but they could adapt what worked. On Flores, Budi was beside himself with excitement when garbled tales of the new weapon reached them through the Indonesian island grapevine. "Pointed sticks that fly straight," he exclaimed to City. "I told you, I invented that." "You invented a stick that fell after 6 feet, City reminded him. "This flies 40 yards. "Details," Budi muttered, but he was already trying to recreate what he'd heard described. The hobbit's smaller size meant smaller bows, but also meant they could hunt from trees where dragons couldn't reach. It was perfect for their niche. The bow's impact rippled across the human world like a stone in a pond. Suddenly, Sapiens could hunt from safety. They could defend territory without risking close combat. Most terrifyingly for other species, they could wage war from distances that made traditional combat obsolete. "We need to learn this," Grok Jr. told his father, "or we need to leave." It was the most progressive thing any Neanderthal had said in 200,000 years of conservative tradition. Grok Sr. wanted to argue, but watching his Sapiens daughter-in-law teaching archery to what would have been his grandchildren, strange hybrid grandchildren with robust bodies but innovative minds, he knew the world had changed. The bow was more than a weapon. It was a philosophy. It said that human survival didn't depend on being strongest or fastest or toughest. It depended on being smartest, on seeing potential energy in bent wood, on imagining trajectories that didn't exist yet. Tycho, still just 17 and proud of his invention, had no idea he'd just signed the death warrant for every other human species. He was just happy he could hunt without getting stepped on by mammoths. But in the end, that's how revolutions happen. Not with grand plans or manifestos, but with teenagers too lazy to do things the hard way. When Shag, Grok's elderly uncle, broke his hip chasing what he thought was a rabbit, but turned out to be a very upset wolverine, conventional Pleistocene wisdom said he was done. A Neanderthal who couldn't hunt was a Neanderthal who didn't eat. That's just math. But Shag was still alive 6 months later, and not just alive. He was thriving, teaching the young ones advanced flint knapping and telling increasingly embellished stories about that time he fought off 3 cave bears with nothing but an attitude and a stick. This was Neanderthal Medicare in action, and it would have made modern healthcare administrators weep with envy. The Shanidar cave excavations would later reveal the extent of Neanderthal healthcare, but Grok's band was living it. They had Shag with his hip, Erg with a withered arm from a childhood cave bear encounter, and Marga who'd been blind in one eye since a hunting accident a decade ago. By rights, none of them should have survived. But here they were, contributing members of society who just happened to need a little extra help. "Shag knows every watering hole from here to the big glacier," Grok explained to his sapien son-in-law, who was still wrapping his head around Neanderthal social services. "Losing him would be like losing Google Maps," Asha suggested, though the translation was rough. "What's a Google?" "Never mind. You're saying knowledge is worth more than hunting ability." Grok looked at her like she'd asked if water was wet. "Knowledge is hunting ability. Shag can't throw spear, but he tells us where herds go, worth 10 strong hunters." This was the thing about Neanderthal healthcare. It wasn't charity, it was practical. Every elderly Neanderthal was a walking encyclopedia of survival information, weather patterns, animal behavior, which plants made you dead versus which plants made you wish you were dead. You didn't keep them alive out of sentiment. You kept them alive because letting them die was like burning libraries. The care itself was surprisingly sophisticated. When Shag broke his hip, the band's designated healer, usually an older woman who'd seen enough injuries to know what worked, Set the bone using techniques that would be familiar to any modern EMT. Splinting with straight branches, immobilization with leather wraps, and most importantly, enforced rest. Rest is the hardest part, Grok's mother Marge explained to Asha, who was learning Neanderthal medicine whether she wanted to or not. Neanderthal men think they're immortal, have to tie them down sometimes. Pain management involved willow bark, containing aspirin's ancestor, various fermented beverages that definitely weren't for pain but nobody asked questions, and distraction techniques mainly involving competitive storytelling about who'd survived worse injuries. Physical therapy was handled by the simple expedient of having to contribute to survive. Shag couldn't hunt, but he could nap. Erg couldn't throw with his withered arm, but he could set traps. Magar couldn't spot prey at distance, but her remaining eye was sharp enough for close work like hide preparation. Everyone contributes, Marge said firmly, no freeloaders. But the real revelation was preventive care. Neanderthal children learned from infancy how to fall correctly, how to read animal body language, how to identify the "I'm about to charge" stance in everything from rabbits to rhinoceros. They practiced emergency first aid on each other with the dedication of medical students, because unlike medical students, their lives actually depended on it. The contrast with other species was stark. When Tenzin's father started coughing up blood in the Denisovan band, there was resignation but little medical intervention. At that altitude, with those resources, you either recovered on your own or you didn't. The band would support you as long as practical, but if you couldn't keep up with migrations, hard choices had to be made. Mountain chooses who lives, Norbu said simply when the topic came up. We just follow Mountain's decision. Homo erectus, with their million-year track record, had basic wound care down to an art, but their solutions hadn't evolved much past rub dirt in it and walk it off. They'd survived everything Earth could throw at them, but they'd done it through sheer stubbornness rather than medical innovation. On Flores, the hobbits had developed specialized treatments for dragon bites, mostly involving running away before you got bitten. But their small population meant losing even one individual was catastrophic. They couldn't afford the luxury of long-term care. Must be nice, City said wistfully when news of Neanderthal healthcare reached them. Having enough people that some can stop hunting. But Shag's survival represented more than just medical care. It was a philosophy that said every band member had value beyond their immediate productivity. That experience and knowledge were resources worth preserving. That a broken hip didn't mean a broken person. Modern hospitals would recognize the holistic approach: medical treatment, occupational therapy, social support, and purpose-driven recovery. They'd just be shocked it was happening 100,000 years before the invention of insurance paperwork. Shag will probably outlive us all, Grok muttered, watching his uncle regale children with definitely exaggerated Wolverine stories. Too stubborn to die. That's not stubbornness, Asha observed. That's community. And she was right. Neanderthal Medicare wasn't just about healing bodies. It was about maintaining the social fabric that made survival possible. Every elder saved was a library preserved, a teacher retained, a connection to the past that informed the future. It was, in its own way, more advanced than anything the innovative sapiens had developed. They just didn't have a billing department. High in the Tibetan plateau, where oxygen was a luxury and trees were a distant memory, Tenzin's mother Pima was performing medical miracles with plants that wouldn't be discovered by Western medicine for another 99,900 years. She called it not dying. Everyone else called it impossible. The morning started as most emergencies did, with someone doing something stupendously stupid. Norbu's son had decided to prove his manhood by wrestling a yak calf. The calf's mother had objected. Violently, now the boy lay unconscious with a hoof-shaped dent in his skull and breathing that sounded like a broken bellows. In the valleys below, this would be a death sentence. Up here, at 14,000 feet where every breath was already a struggle, it should have been funeral preparations. But Pima had other plans. Rhodiola first, she muttered, crushing the golden root between stones worn smooth by generations of medicine women, for the breathing, then yarrow for the bleeding inside. She worked with the focused intensity of an emergency room surgeon, if emergency rooms were wind-scoured caves and surgical instruments were rocks and hope. The Denisovan pharmacy was unlike anything other human species had developed, where Neanderthals relied on willow bark and prayer, where sapiens were just discovering that plants could be medicine. The Denisovans had been forced by altitude to become biochemists. Valley plants don't grow here, Pima explained to her daughter, who was learning whether she wanted to or not. Denisovan Medical School had a 100% enrollment rate and no student loans. Must use what Mountain gives. Mountain gives strange gifts. Strange indeed. The rhodiola that grew in crevices where nothing else could survive didn't just help with altitude. It was a cognitive enhancer that would later be used by Soviet cosmonauts. The snow lotus that bloomed for exactly 3 weeks each summer was an anti-inflammatory that made willow bark look like candy. The cordyceps fungus that grew from dead insects was, well, that one was just weird, but it kept you alive when nothing else would. Medicine is about reading the mountain, Pema continued, checking the boy's pupils with the practiced ease of someone who'd seen every possible yak-related injury. Plants that survive here are fighters. We borrow their fight. The real innovation was in preparation. Valley dwellers could afford to be casual with their medicine, boil some bark, chew some leaves, hope for the best. At altitude, where margin for error was measured in heartbeats, precision mattered. Pema's preparations involved exact timing, specific temperatures, maintained by carefully controlled yak dung fires, and combinations that had been refined through thousands of years of trial and error. Mostly error, but the successes were literally written in the survival of her people. This one, she held up a dried fungus that looked like something from a horror movie, only works if dried under full moon. Don't ask why. Great-great-grandmother discovered this. Many people died before she figured out timing. The boy's breathing was stabilizing, his color improving from fresh corpse to merely mostly dead. Pema allowed herself a small smile, another victory against the mountain's attempts to kill them all. Word of Denisovan medicine had spread, carried by the extensive trading networks that crisscrossed Asia. Sapiens traders would climb ridiculous altitudes to trade for preparations they didn't understand, but knew worked. Neanderthal hunting parties would detour days out of their way for Pema's headache remedies. They always want the easy fixes, Pema complained. Headache powder, wound salve, baby-making tea. Never want to learn the why. The why was what separated Denisovan medicine from everyone else's. They didn't just know that certain plants worked, they knew why they worked, even if they couldn't articulate it in modern terms. They understood that the body at altitude was different from the body at sea level, that medications had to account for reduced oxygen, increased UV radiation, extreme cold. Your blood is different up here, Pema told a visiting Sapiens trader who was gasping like a landed fish. Thick like yak butter, Valley medicine assumes thin blood. We know better. The trader, who'd climbed 10,000 feet to trade shells for altitude sickness remedies, just nodded and tried not to pass out. The medicine worked. His headache was fading, his vision clearing. He didn't need to understand why. But Pema's daughter did. She was learning not just which plants to use, but how to read the subtle signs that indicated potency, how weather patterns affected medicinal properties, how to tell if a fungus was medicine or poison. Sometimes the only difference was dosage. Knowledge dies with the keeper unless passed on, Pema said, watching her daughter practice preparations. Mountain is harsh teacher. doesn't give second chances. The boy was sitting up now, confused but alive. His mother was offering Pema everything she owned in gratitude, furs, tools, even her best yak. Pema waved it all away. "Payment is he lives to make more stupid choices," she said, "and maybe learns yaks always win." This was Denisovan medicine, practical, precise, and with a dark humor born from living where most humans couldn't survive a week. They'd turned pharmacy into an art form, necessity into knowledge that would outlive their species in the DNA of modern Tibetans. "Sometimes I wonder," Pema mused, grinding tomorrow's preparations, "what valley people do with all their extra oxygen. Probably wasted on talking." Her daughter laughed, but it was true. While other humans spent energy on art and innovation, Denisovans spent it on the more fundamental challenge of not dying at altitude. Their pharmacy was their art, their innovation, their gift to humanity's future. Even if that future would forget who developed it first. In the steaming jungles of Java, the last Homo erectus matriarch sat on the same rock her ancestors had used for 1,000,000 years, using the same stone tool design her great-great-great, add about 50,000 more greats, grandmother had perfected, wondering why the world had suddenly become so complicated. Her name, if she had one, is lost to time. Let's call her Vera, because Venerable Erectus Representative is too long and she deserves dignity in her final years. At 45, she was ancient by Homo erectus standards, a walking museum of techniques that had worked since before ice ages were trendy. "New people," she said to her grandson, words simple and direct in the erectus way. "Strange tools, strange thinking." The grandson, who'd never known a world without these new people, just nodded. To him, Vera's stories of when Erectus ruled from Africa to Asia sounded like mythology. How could one species spread so far? How could they survive so long? "We walked," Vera said, as if reading his mind, which, given their 1,000,000-year shared history, she basically could. Others waited for right conditions. We just walked. Ice, walk around. Desert, walk through. Ocean, walk different way. This was Erectus philosophy distilled. When in doubt, walk. It had worked for 1.8 million years. They'd outlived climate changes that killed everything else, survived predators that made modern apex predators look like puppies, and spread across more of the planet than any human species before or since. Their toolkit, which Vera was patiently demonstrating for the 1,000th time, was simplicity perfected. The Aculian hand axe, teardrop-shaped, bifacially worked, sharp enough to butcher an elephant, sturdy enough to crack bones. One tool, infinite uses. Why complicate things? New people make different tool for everything, she muttered, watching her grandson practice. Tool for cutting meat, different tool for cutting plant, different tool for cutting hide. Wasteful. Confusing. But even Vera had to admit, privately, never out loud, that the world was changing in ways that walking couldn't solve. The open woodlands Erectus had evolved in were becoming dense jungle. The animals they'd hunted for millennia were disappearing or changing habits. And these new people, sapiens, though Vera didn't know the name, were doing things that violated every principle of Erectus common sense. "They throw spears," she said, with the disgust of someone describing a particularly offensive bodily function. Not thrust, throw. Like cowards, like children. Her grandson, who'd secretly been practicing spear throwing after seeing sapiens hunters, said nothing. The real problem wasn't the new people's strange habits, it was their speed. Erectus had always adapted, but they adapted over thousands of generations. See a problem, walk around it, let evolution sort out the details, but these sapiens adapted within single lifetimes. New tools, new techniques, new ideas spreading like wildfire. Fire was enough, Vera said, tending the hearth that had burned continuously for longer than anyone could remember. Fire and walking and good hand axe. What else needed? It was a fair question. Erectus had literally conquered the world with this simple formula. They'd been the first to leave Africa, first to master fire, first to prove humans could live anywhere. Their resume was impeccable, their track record unmatched. But resumes don't mean much when the job requirements change. The jungle around them was full of new sounds now. Sapiens camps with their constant chatter, strange music from instruments Erectus had never imagined needing, art that served no practical purpose, burial rituals that wasted resources on the dead. Maybe, her grandson suggested carefully, we could learn some new ways, add to old ways. Vera looked at him with eyes that had seen more history than any human eyes ever would again. She'd watched the last mainland Erectus populations flicker and die, seen ancient territories claimed by newcomers, witnessed the slow contraction of her people to this final island refuge. New ways are for new people, she said finally. We are old people, oldest people. We know our ways. It wasn't stubbornness exactly. It was the weight of success. When you've survived everything Earth could throw at you for nearly 2 million years, why would you change? The answer, of course, was that Earth had stopped throwing the same things. That night, Vera dreamed of her ancestors walking, always walking, across grasslands that stretched forever, through valleys that no longer existed, past lakes that had become deserts. 2 million years of footsteps, and nowhere left to go. Her grandson practiced throwing spears in secret, but his form was wrong, his technique inherited from a million years of thrusting, not throwing. He was trying to save his people by becoming something they weren't. Vera knew, with the wisdom of the truly ancient, that it was already too late. You can't learn to be young when you're already old. You can't adopt innovation when your entire existence is based on tradition. You can't become sapiens when you've spent 2 million years perfecting being Erectus. We had good run, she told the fire, speaking to all the ancestors who'd tended it before her. Longest run, best run. And in that, at least, she was absolutely right. When Vera died, peaceful and ancient, she took with her memories stretching back to humanity's dawn. The last library of Erectus knowledge, closed forever. Her grandson buried her with a hand axe, perfectly made, utterly useless in a world that had moved beyond its simple perfection. He tried to remember all her stories, all her techniques, but already they were fading, replaced by new ideas from new people in a new world. 2 million years of experience, gone like smoke from a dying fire. The shell was perfect. Nassarius Krausianus, about the size of a pea, with a natural hole that just needed a little enlarging. Asher held it up to the light, already envisioning it as part of the necklace that would make her the most fashionable person at the spring gathering. Fashion in 100,000 BCE, while Neanderthals were wearing eau de mammoth and calling it good, Homo sapiens were inventing the concept of looking good for no practical reason whatsoever. Waste of time, Grok Jr. muttered, watching his wife spend hours sorting shells by size, color, and some aesthetic quality only she could see. Shells don't keep you warm, don't help hunt, don't fill belly. They fill something else, Asher replied, stringing another shell onto sinew with the concentration of a jeweler setting diamonds. Same thing that makes you arrange those cave bear skulls just so. Same thing that makes your mother braid her hair in patterns. That's different. That's fashion, Asher said smugly. You just don't have word for it yet. She was right. Across the sapiens world, from Blombos Cave to Morocco, humans were discovering that how you looked mattered as much as what you did, and shells were the first designer labels. The shell trade was already international. Nassarius shells from the Mediterranean were found 200 kilometers inland. Dentalium shells from the Red Sea appeared in caves nowhere near water. Someone was walking ridiculous distances for what Neanderthals saw as useless water rocks. It's not about the shells, Kea explained to yet another confused Neanderthal. It's about what they mean. This pattern means I'm from the coast people. That color means I've traveled to the red cliff bands. These shells together mean I survived the bad winter when the babies died. Why not just say those things? The Neanderthal asked, genuinely puzzled. Because then you'd have to talk to everyone. This way, they know just by looking. It was the birth of visual communication, and it was driving the other species crazy. Denisovans, practical to their core, couldn't fathom wasting energy on decoration when that energy could be spent not dying at altitude. Homo erectus, with their million-year-old traditional designs, saw no reason to advertise anything about themselves. If you couldn't tell who they were by their hand axes, you weren't worth knowing. But on Flores, the hobbits were intrigued. Small shells for small people, Buddy announced. Having immediately grasped the possibilities, we could make tiny patterns. Dragon scales in miniature. Who would we show them to? City asked. The 7 other families on the island? They already know who we are. Details, Buddy said, already planning an entire hobbit fashion industry that would never have enough customers to matter. The real innovation wasn't just wearing shells, it was the whole production chain. Sapiens were heat-treating ochre to get specific shades of red, mixing it with fat to create body paint that wouldn't wash off, then combining it with shell patterns to create complex identity markers. This one's for tomorrow. Asher showed Grok Jr. a particularly elaborate piece involving shells, beads made from ostrich eggshells, and bits of carved bone. For the gathering. The gathering where we trade food and tools and actually useful things. The gathering where Mira's daughter will be wearing last season's shells and everyone will know my design is better. Grok Jr. Neanderthal brain vapor locked. Competition over resources, he understood. Competition over aesthetics was like trying to understand quantum physics before physics was invented. But the shell industry was creating something more important than fashion. It was creating identity. Tribes separated by vast distances could recognize each other by shell patterns. Marriage negotiations could begin based on jewelry choices. Trade relationships were established through aesthetic preferences. My grandmother's shells, one young woman would say at a gathering, showing a pattern passed down through generations. The shells themselves might be replaced, but the design was family history made wearable. And then there was the economics. Good shells were becoming currency. A perfect Nassarius was worth days of meat. Rare colors commanded premium trades. Sapiens were inventing market economics through jewelry, and nobody else understood why. They're broken, Grok Sr. declared, watching Sapiens traders argue over shell quality with the passion of stockbrokers. Minds diseased, caring more about decoration than food. But Vera the Erectus, ancient and tired, saw it differently. On one of her last walks before the end, she'd encountered a Sapiens woman wearing shells that told a story, where she'd been, who she'd loved, what she'd survived. Not broken, Vera had said in her simple way, different, new. We tell stories with words. They tell stories with wearing. The shell shock was spreading. Even conservative Neanderthals were starting to pick up pretty rocks. Denisovan traders were noting which shells commanded highest prices in the valleys. Everyone was slowly realizing that Sapiens had invented something that transcended practical needs. They'd invented meaning you could wear, identity you could trade, status you could string on sinew. They'd invented fashion, and with it, the idea that humans were more than just surviving meat. Next gathering, Asher promised, adding another shell to her masterpiece. Everyone will want to copy this pattern. But I'll already have new design. Always ahead. Always better. Always confusing, Grok Jr. muttered, but he was already collecting unusual shells on his hunts, just in case they might make his strange sapiens wife smile. The fashion industry was born, and with it, the endless human cycle of wanting what others had, creating what others wanted, and always needing something newer, even if it was just shells on a string. If a modern meteorologist traveled back 100,000 years, they'd quit their job, burn their degrees, and take up something less stressful, like bomb disposal or teaching middle school. The weather wasn't just unpredictable, it was actively psychotic. "Sky is angry again," Tenzin's father wheezed, watching clouds form patterns that shouldn't exist at this altitude. He'd seen a lot in his 40 years, but the way weather had been acting lately made him wonder if the mountain spirits had been drinking fermented yak milk. He wasn't wrong. Earth was in the middle of marine isotope stage 5C, which sounded clinical and scientific until you realized it meant climate having a nervous breakdown. Temperature swings of 10 degrees Celsius within decades, rainfall patterns that would switch from Amazon wet to Sahara dry within a human lifetime. Sea levels yo-yoing like a toddler with a toy. Down in the valleys, Grok's band was dealing with their own weather mysteries. The summer had been too long, not nice extended vacation too long, but plants dying because they need winter dormancy too long. The usual autumn rains hadn't come. The river was lower than any elder remembered. "In my grandfather's time," Grok Sr. began, launching into what would have been a climate data presentation if PowerPoint existed. "Winter came when leaves turned red. Grandfather's grandfather, same. His grandfather, same. Now, leaves turn red, die. No winter. Sky is broken." The Neanderthals had thrived during ice ages, their bodies built for cold. This warming trend was like forcing a polar bear to summer in Miami. They were sweating in temperatures their ancestors would have considered perfect for food storage. But the real chaos was happening to the sapiens, spread across multiple climate zones and discovering that none of them were stable. The rains used to come from there. Kia pointed west, where monsoons had arrived predictably for generations. Now they come from there. She pointed south, where no rain should come from. Sometimes both, sometimes neither. It's like the sky is learning new patterns. She wasn't wrong. The Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, the great ocean conveyor belt that regulated global climate, was stuttering like a broken engine. When it worked, weather was predictable. When it hiccuped, Europe could go from temperate to tundra in decades. On Flores, the hobbits were experiencing their own version of climate roulette. Sea levels were dropping, connecting their island to others, creating land bridges that shouldn't exist. New animals were arriving, familiar ones were leaving. "Big Island is getting bigger," Buddy observed, watching the receding shoreline. "Soon we can walk to where tall people live. This is good." "This is terrifying," City corrected. "If we can walk there, everything can walk here, including things that eat hobbits." The Denisovans, masters of altitude, were finding that altitude itself was becoming unreliable. Glaciers that had been permanent features were calving. Valleys that had been ice-locked were opening. The vertical world they'd mastered was rearranging itself. "Mountain moves," Norbu said simply, but the implications were anything but simple. Their entire lifestyle depended on knowing exactly which passes would be open, when, where animals would shelter, how weather would flow through valleys. All that knowledge was becoming obsolete. But the scariest part wasn't the changes themselves, it was the speed. Climate had always changed. Ice ages came and went like very slow seasons, but usually the changes took millennia, giving evolution time to adapt. Now changes that should take thousands of years were happening in decades. My daughter won't know the world I knew, Vera the Erectus said, with the fatalism of someone whose species had survived everything but might not survive this. Her daughter won't know her world. Change too fast, evolution too slow. The irony was bitter. Humans had evolved to be adaptable, but there were limits. When the entire environmental rulebook got rewritten every generation, even the most flexible species struggled. Different human species responded differently. Neanderthals, conservative by nature, tried to maintain traditional patterns even as those patterns failed. Erectus, with their million-year track record, kept doing what had always worked, even as it stopped working. Denisovans adapted locally but couldn't handle changes at continental scales. Only sapiens, with their distributed populations and obsessive information sharing, were accidentally positioned to survive. Not because they were better adapted to any specific climate, but because they were badly adapted to everything and therefore not specialized for conditions that no longer existed. Weather is like people now, Asha observed, watching storm patterns that belonged in different seasons collide. Unpredictable, mixing things that shouldn't mix, creating new patterns. Weather was always like that, Grok Jr. corrected. We just lived short enough to think it was stable. He was right. The real weather report from 100,000 years ago was simple. Expect chaos. Plan for nothing. Adapt or die. And in the background, like a bass note too low to hear, the climate was winding up for the Toba eruption that would make current weather chaos look like a gentle spring rain. The forecast for the next 1,000 years. Ash with a chance of near extinction. The decision to leave wasn't dramatic. There was no council meeting, no great proclamation. Just Kaya's grandmother's cousin's band showing up one day with haunted eyes and stories of empty hunting grounds. North is dead, their leader said simply. Ice comes early, stays late, herds gone, plants gone. We go south, or we go extinct. This was happening across Africa as the Sahara, which had been a parkland of lakes and grasslands, began its transformation into the desert we know today. The green corridors that had connected populations were closing. Water sources that had been reliable for thousands of years were failing. Humans had two choices: follow the resources south or die trying to maintain territories that could no longer support them. Kaya's band held out for another season, then another. Pride, stubbornness, and deep knowledge of their territory made leaving feel like betrayal. But when the children started showing the hollow-eyed look of chronic hunger, even the elders agreed it was time. We are walking people, Kaya's mother said, invoking the deepest sapiens tradition. When the world changes, we walk to where it hasn't changed yet. The Exodus wasn't a single movement, but thousands of individual decisions creating a tide. Bands that had been stable for generations packed up overnight. Traditional enemies found themselves walking the same paths, united by the common enemy of starvation. Strange days, one elder muttered, sharing a water source with a band they'd been feuding with since before anyone remembered why. Next, we'll be sharing hunting grounds with Neanderthals. He meant it as a joke. He didn't know that up north, that was exactly what was happening. As sapiens pushed south, they pushed into territories held by other human species for hundreds of thousands of years. It wasn't invasion, it was desperation dominoes. The Neanderthals, facing their own climate pressures, were also moving, but their movement was different. Where sapiens scattered like seeds, each band finding its own path, Neanderthals moved like glaciers, slowly, reluctantly, maintaining group cohesion at all costs. We don't run, Grok Sr. declared, even as his hunting grounds became increasingly empty. This is our land, has been since before your people existed. But even Neanderthal stubbornness had limits. When your choice is move or watch your children starve, ideology becomes flexible. The great Neanderthal populations of Europe began their own slow southern drift. maintaining their cultural identity even as their geography shifted. The Denisovans faced a different challenge. You can't move south when you live on top of the world. Instead, they moved down, abandoning their highest settlements for valleys that had been beneath their notice. It was cultural death by 1,000 compromises. "We are mountain people," Tenzin's father said, but the words carried less conviction when spoken at 8,000 feet instead of 14,000. High mountain people, medium mountain people, still mountain people. The hobbits on Flores watched the mainland movements with interest but little concern. When your entire world is an island, continental drift, cultural or otherwise, seems abstract. But they didn't realize that the southern exodus would eventually reach even their isolated paradise. The real tragedy was Homo erectus. With populations already fractured and isolated, they had nowhere to go. The Java population was trapped on an island becoming increasingly inhospitable. Mainland populations were squeezed between advancing sapiens and territories they'd lost the knowledge to exploit. "We walked first," Vera said, watching sapiens bands pass through territories Erectus had held for millennia. "Walked everywhere. Now others walk through us like we're ghosts." The exodus created unprecedented mixing. Water sources became meeting points for species that had avoided each other for thousands of years. Technologies were exchanged, sometimes voluntarily, often through observation and copying. Genes were exchanged too, in fumbling encounters between young people who didn't care about species boundaries. "World getting smaller," Asher observed, her band now sharing a valley with 2 other sapiens bands, a Neanderthal family group, and rumors of Denisovans in the high passes. "Soon no place left, that's just ours." She was prophetic. The great southern exodus wasn't just a migration, it was a compression, forcing different human populations into smaller territories, increasing competition, accelerating cultural exchange, and setting the stage for the final shakeout that would leave only one human species standing. But in the moment, it was just survival. One foot in front of the other. Following water, following herds, following hope that somewhere south the world still made sense. "My children will be southern people," Kea said, watching her band disappear into the heat haze. "Will they remember we were once northern people? Will it matter?" It would matter to archaeologists 100,000 years later, tracking the genetic and cultural trails of the Exodus. But to the children growing up knowing only the southern lands, the north would be just stories. Tales of a green Sahara as fantastical as any myth. The Great Southern Exodus was humanity's first continental reorganization. It wouldn't be the last. But it was the one that taught humans a fundamental truth. Home isn't a place. It's wherever you can survive. And sometimes survival means walking away from everything you've ever known. Islands do weird things to evolution. Take a normal-sized elephant, stick it on an island for a few 100,000 years, and you get a pocket-sized proboscidean that a hobbit can hunt. Take a regular human, do the same thing, and apparently you get hobbits. Evolution has a sense of humor, and islands are its comedy clubs. Flores wasn't the only island running evolutionary experiments. Across Indonesia, isolation was creating human varieties that would make modern geneticists weep with frustration and fascination. Each island was a laboratory, each population a unique experiment in how far you could stretch the definition of human. On Sulawesi, rumors persisted of humans who'd gone the opposite direction from the hobbits, giants who stood 7 feet tall. Whether these were just tall Denisovans, extinct species, or fishermen's tales enhanced by fermented coconut, nobody knew. But the stories were consistent enough to make traders nervous about certain valleys. "Big people, big spears, big problems," one Javanese trader summarized. "We trade with coast people only." Luzon had its own population. Not quite hobbits, not quite sapiens, definitely not interested in visitors. They'd developed a culture so insular that even their tools looked alien, with design principles that seemed to have branched off from mainstream human technology sometime around the invention of fire and never looked back. But the weirdest island story was playing out on a speck of land that would later be called Socotra, somehow, and marine biologists would spend centuries failing to explain this. A population of humans had made it to an island 240 miles off the Arabian coast, with no evidence of boats or rafts, or any logical way to cross open ocean. Maybe they walked when ocean was smaller, suggested one trader who'd encountered them. Ocean was never that small, another corrected. Maybe they're very good at holding breath? The Socotrans, not their real name, which was unpronounceable to anyone not born there, had developed in isolation for so long they barely looked human anymore. Not in a hobbit way or a giant way, but in a what happens when you put humans in a place with dragons' blood trees and no outside contact for 50,000 years way. Their language had evolved so far from any known human tongue that even the polyglot sapiens traders couldn't make sense of it. Their tools were functional but followed no known tradition. Their culture was like looking at humanity through a funhouse mirror, recognizable but wrong in every detail. They're friendly enough, one brave trader reported. Traded shells for something, not sure what. Might be food, might be decoration, might be religious artifact. Smells like all three. The real evolutionary action was happening in the Philippines, where sea levels had created and destroyed island chains like a deity with commitment issues. Populations would be isolated for millennia, develop unique traits, then suddenly find themselves connected to other islands when sea levels dropped. It was speed dating for evolution. Different island, different people, Budi observed during one of the rare inter-island gatherings when sea levels permitted. That island, tall people with flat faces. This island, short people with long arms. Next island, medium people with weird teeth. Like someone making humans from clay but forgetting recipe. The hobbits of Flores were actually the stable ones in this chaos. They'd been isolated long enough to reach evolutionary equilibrium. 3 feet tall, perfect for limited resources. Big feet, great for climbing. Tiny brains. Who needs big brains when your biggest problem is avoiding Komodo dragons? But even Flores was feeling the pressure of the outside world. Tales of tall strangers were becoming more common. Fires on distant islands were visible on clear nights. The splendid isolation that had created the hobbits was cracking. Change coming, City said, watching unfamiliar birds arrive from the north. Birds know. Birds always first. She was right. The islands had been evolutionary laboratories, creating human varieties that challenged every assumption about what our species could become. But laboratories only work in isolation. As sea levels fluctuated and populations moved, the experiments were contaminating each other. Denisovan genes were flowing into island populations through rare but significant contact. Sapiens traders were introducing new technologies that disrupted millennia-old adaptations. Even the ultra-isolated Socotrans were showing signs of outside contact. Shell jewelry that matched mainland styles, tools that suggested traded knowledge. Islands used to be separate worlds, an old Sulawesi trader mused. Now they're just distant villages. Soon, no more special island people. Just people. It was a loss that wouldn't be fully understood for 100,000 years. Each island population represented a unique solution to human survival. The hobbits showed minimum viable human size. The Socotrans demonstrated maximum cultural divergence. Others explored different extremes: dietary, social, technological. But evolution needs isolation to run experiments. As the islands became connected, the experiments merged, averaged out, normalized. The weird and wonderful varieties were absorbed into the growing tide of Homo sapiens Standard Edition. The islands of misfit humans were becoming just islands. The misfits were becoming myths. And somewhere in the Philippines, the last population of humans with perfectly adapted teeth for eating nothing but shellfish looked at their children, who preferred mainland food, and knew their time was ending. Evolution's comedy club was closing. The experimental theater of island humanity was going dark. Soon, there would be only one type of human, everywhere. But for now, for this brief moment 100,000 years ago, humanity was a carnival of possibilities. Giants and hobbits and everything in between, each island a different answer to the question, what else could humans become? The answer, it turned out, was anything. The tragedy was that anything would eventually become one thing. But what a glorious, weird, impossible anything it was while it lasted. Nobody saw it coming. How could they? Volcanoes were just mountains that occasionally burped fire and made good obsidian for tool making. Sure, sometimes they got grumpy and you had to move your camp, but they were local problems. Background noise in a world full of more immediate dangers like saber-toothed cats and mother-in-laws. Then Toba erupted. It wasn't an eruption. It was the planet trying to kill everything that walked on two legs. Located in what would become Sumatra, Toba didn't just blow its top. It deleted its entire middle in an explosion that made every other volcanic event look like a birthday candle. The blast itself was just the opening act. Anyone within 1,000 miles was already dead, vaporized, buried in pyroclastic flows, or crushed by the shockwave. But that was the lucky ones. They died fast. Everyone else got to experience volcanic winter. Sky is gone. Tenzin's son whispered, looking up at where blue should be, but finding only grey. It had been 3 months since the southern mountain exploded. They'd seen the flash on the horizon, felt the ground shake even at this distance. But this was wrong. The ash cloud had circled the planet, blocking sunlight with the efficiency of a planetary blackout curtain. Temperatures plummeted 15 degrees Celsius globally. In places that were already cold, it meant death. In places that were warm, it meant confusion, crop failure, ecosystem collapse. Plants won't grow in dark, Kaya's daughter observed with the straightforward logic of a child watching her mother's carefully tended wild grain plots wither and die. What we eat when plants gone? It was the question every human on the planet was asking. The Toba eruption had triggered a volcanic winter that would last 6 to 10 years. 6 to 10 years of darkness, cold, and death. Homo erectus, already struggling with climate change and competition, faced extinction. Their Java populations, closest to the blast, were gone. Mainland populations, dependent on predictable resources and lacking the flexibility to adapt quickly, died in droves. Walk, Vera whispered to her grandson as she lay dying, the last word of the last Erectus matriarch carrying 2 million years of wisdom. But there was nowhere left to walk to. The whole world was dying. The Neanderthals fared better initially, built for cold, experienced with harsh winters. They hunkered down and endured. But even they had limits. Populations crashed. Genetic bottlenecks that would haunt the species formed as bands died out, leaving only scattered survivors. We've survived ice before, Grok Sr. said, but his confidence was hollow. This wasn't normal ice. This was ice with poison, sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere creating acid rain that killed plants, poisoned water, made breathing painful. The Denisovans, already adapted to harsh conditions, discovered that there were levels of harsh even they couldn't handle. Altitude provided no escape from global winter. If anything, it made things worse. Less atmosphere to trap what little heat remained. Mountain spirits angry at whole world, Pema said. watching her medicine plants die, despite all her knowledge. No medicine for angry sky. On Flores, the hobbits faced a different crisis. The explosion was distant enough that they avoided the worst direct effects, but the tsunamis that followed wreaked havoc on their coastal resources. Then came the darkness, and with it, the death of plants that fed the animals they hunted. Even dragons dying, Budi reported, finding a Komodo dragon dead from starvation. When the apex predators started dying, you knew the ecosystem was collapsing, but hidden in the catastrophe was an inadvertent experiment in human resilience. Some populations, through luck, location, or sheer stubborn refusal to die, survived, and in surviving, they revealed something crucial about humanity's future. The survivors weren't the strongest. The Neanderthals were stronger. They weren't the most established. Erectus had that claim. They weren't the best adapted to specific environments. The Denisovans owned that title. The survivors were the ones who could change fastest, who could switch from hunting to scavenging to eating things that would have disgusted them months before, who could abandon territorial claims and follow any resource that might keep them alive one more day, who could look at 1,000-year-old traditions and say, that's not working anymore, without having an existential crisis. Homo sapiens, scattered across Africa and parts of Eurasia, had population diversity that other species lacked. When populations in East Africa crashed, some in South Africa survived. When coastal groups died, inland groups persevered. Each pocket that survived carried different genetic variants, different cultural knowledge, different survival strategies. We are many peoples in one people, Kea said, her band now mixed with refugees from 3 other groups, including some who'd been enemies before Toba made such distinctions irrelevant. Maybe that's why we live when others die. The bottleneck was severe. Genetic studies would later suggest human population dropped to maybe 10,000 individuals, perhaps as low as 3,000. From billions of potential ancestors, every human alive today descends from this tiny group of volcanic winter survivors. But they did survive, eating leather when meat ran out, grinding bones for the last calories, learning to process foods that required extensive preparation to be edible, developing technologies born of desperation that would become standard practice. When the sky finally began to clear, slowly, painfully, over years, the world that emerged was different, emptier. Homo erectus was gone or reduced to remnants that would soon follow. Neanderthal populations were fragmented, vulnerable. Denisovans were scattered to the winds. But Homo sapiens, battered and traumatized and reduced to genetic remnants, had learned the most important lesson possible. When the world ends, the only rule is there are no rules. Tradition, territory, and ancient wisdom mean nothing if they don't keep you alive. Toba had nearly ended humanity. Instead, it had created modern humans, not through evolution, but through education. The ultimate crash course in adaptability. The tuition had been paid in species. The shell was nothing special, a small cowrie worn smooth by handling. But it had travelled 3,000 miles to get here, passed through 17 different hands, and carried with it something more valuable than any tool or weapon: information. Western people say the Fire Mountain has stopped, the trader explained, turning the shell over to show markings that meant nothing to Grok Jr., but apparently told entire stories to those who could read them. Sky clearing, animals returning, but different animals, strange ones. This was the new world after Toba. With populations scattered and traditional territories meaningless, the old isolation was impossible. Humans had to trade or die, and in trading, they created the first global information network. The trading post at what would become the Horn of Africa was typical of the new meeting places. A freshwater spring, defensible heights, and crucially, neutral ground. No species claimed it. Everyone needed it. So everyone shared it warily, creating the world's first demilitarized zones. Never thought I'd be trading with Neanderthals, Kia admitted, watching Grok Jr. demonstrate his people's superior hide-working techniques to a fascinated Sapiens audience. Never thought they'd have anything we needed. But they did. Neanderthal cold-weather clothing technology was unmatched. Their hide processing created waterproof seams that Sapiens couldn't replicate. In exchange, Sapiens offered preserved foods, long-distance information, and, increasingly, bow technology that Neanderthals were grudgingly beginning to accept. "Still think throwing is cowardice," Grok Jr. muttered, but he was fitting an arrow to string with improving competence. "But cowardice that puts meat in pot is better than honor that doesn't." The Denisovans had become the ultimate middlemen. Their ability to navigate altitude meant they could connect lowland populations that couldn't reach each other directly. They carried more than goods. They carried genes, diseases, and ideas across impossible terrain. "We are bridge people now," Norbu explained, his pack loaded with coastal shells heading for inland tribes and mountain herbs heading for the coast. Not mountain people, not valley people, bridge people. But the real revolution was happening with island traders. The catastrophe of Toba had, paradoxically, improved seafaring. Desperate populations had taken to the water in anything that floated, and some had discovered that open ocean wasn't always death. It was just, usually, death. 3 boats left. 1 survivor reported at a trading post. 1 arrived, but 1 is better than none. The hobbits, forced out of isolation by post-Toba resource scarcity, had become unlikely trading magnates. Their small size meant boats could carry more of them, requiring less food for ocean journeys. They were also discovering that being underestimated was a powerful negotiating tool. "Big people think small people stupid," City explained to Budi as they prepared for another trading expedition. "Let them think. We count shells while they count fingers." The trading posts weren't just economic centers, they were evolutionary accelerators. Technologies that had taken millennia to develop were spreading in years. Composite tools, fishing techniques, food preservation methods, medicine, all flowing along trade routes like blood through arteries. But more importantly, ideas were flowing. Creation myths were being compared and combined. Astronomical observations were being shared and refined. The concept that humans could be different but equal was slowly, painfully being born. "Your people have stories of the Fire Mountain," a Sapiens trader said to a Neanderthal. "Our people too. Same mountain, same time, different stories. Maybe both true?" It was a radical thought, that truth could have multiple versions, that different peoples could experience the same event differently and both be right. It was the kind of thinking that only happened when survival depended on cooperation with strangers. The trading posts also became refugee centers. Populations displaced by climate change, resource depletion, or simple bad luck could find temporary shelter and information about where to go next. The old territorial boundaries were meaningless when everyone was displaced. "Home is where you don't starve," became the traders' motto. Citizenship in the post-Toba world was fluid, determined more by who would feed you than who gave birth to you. Erectus refugees, the last scattered remnants of Earth's longest-lasting human species, sometimes appeared at trading posts. Old, confused, carrying tool designs that predated everyone else's by eons. They were living fossils, and everyone knew it, including them. "We had good run," one old Erectus man said, trading a perfectly made hand axe for enough food to last a week. "Longest run, but running done now." The tragedy was palpable, but the trading posts were creating something new from the ashes of the old. A proto-economy based on mutual need. information networks that spanned continents, genetic mixing that would give future humans the diversity to survive anything. Before Fire Mountain, we were many peoples pretending to be alone, Asha observed, her neck decorated with shells from oceans she'd never seen, wearing hide processed with Neanderthal techniques, carrying tools that combined traditions from 6 different cultures. Now we're alone, people learning to be many. The trading posts at the end of the world weren't just places to exchange goods. They were the birthplace of globalization, 100,000 years before the globe was even mapped. They were universities where species taught each other. They were refugee camps for the displaced. They were neutral grounds for enemies. They were, in their rough and desperate way, the first truly human institutions, places where what you could contribute mattered more than what species you were. The shell that had traveled 3,000 miles carried no intrinsic value, but it carried proof that somewhere, 3,000 miles away, humans were surviving. And in the post-Toba world, that information was worth more than all the perfect hand axes ever made. The world was ending. Trade was building a new one. One shell, one story, one survival technique at a time. The cough started innocuously enough. A Sapiens trader arriving at the neutral springs near what would become the Dead Sea, clearing his throat as he unpacked shells from the Mediterranean. By local standards, he wasn't even sick, just fighting off what his band called the walking sneeze. A minor annoyance that swept through Sapiens camps every few years like an inconsiderate relative. To the Neanderthal family he was trading with, it was the beginning of the end. "Your trader brings bad air," Grok Sr. accused 3 days later, watching his grandson struggle to breathe. The boy's robust Neanderthal physiology, built to wrestle cave bears and survive glacier-adjacent temperatures, was failing against an enemy too small to see. The Sapiens trader was genuinely confused. Half his band had the same cough. His own children had survived it with nothing worse than a few days of whining and extra sleep. How could something so trivial be killing these stronger, tougher humans? "Is like when Europeans bring smallpox to Americas," Kea's daughter said, though she wouldn't have used those words, and the Americas wouldn't be discovered by her people for another 85,000 years. But the principle was the same. Diseases that were annoying to one population were apocalyptic to another. The math was brutally simple. Sapiens populations in Africa had been exposed to tropical diseases for 300,000 years. Their immune systems were a library of antibodies, each hard-won through generations of survival. They carried tuberculosis, various gut parasites, respiratory infections, and blood-borne pathogens that they'd learned to coexist with. Neanderthals had their own disease library, but it was written in a different language. Cold-adapted pathogens, cave-dwelling bacteria, European parasites that Sapiens had never encountered. In a fair exchange, both populations should have been equally vulnerable. But the exchange wasn't fair. Sapiens were moving into Neanderthal territory in larger numbers than the reverse. They were bringing African diseases to European immune systems, while Neanderthal diseases mostly stayed in Europe. It was biological imperialism conducted entirely by accident. "We didn't know," the Sapiens trader protested, watching the Neanderthal boy's fever spike. "How could we know?" He was right. Germ theory wouldn't be invented for 99,900 years. The idea that invisible creatures could jump between people and cause disease was as foreign as smartphones to a stone toolmaker. Disease was caused by bad air, angry spirits, or eating the wrong combination of foods. Everyone knew that. The Denisovans fared better initially. Their extreme environments meant fewer shared diseases. Most pathogens couldn't survive the altitude transitions their traders made daily. But that isolation became vulnerability when diseases finally reached them. Valley sickness climbs mountain, Pema noted, treating the 5th case of something that looked like tuberculosis but acted faster. Her mountain medicines, perfectly adapted for altitude-specific ailments, were useless against lowland diseases, turbocharged by thin air. The hobbits faced their own microbial apocalypse. Island populations with limited genetic diversity were immunological sitting ducks. When mainland diseases arrived via trading boats, entire families would succumb to what mainlanders considered childhood illnesses. "Dragon bites we can treat," City said, watching another hobbit child burn with fever. "This invisible biting, no defense." But it wasn't just the diseases themselves, it was the secondary effects. A Neanderthal band where half the adults were sick couldn't hunt effectively. Missed hunts meant malnutrition. Malnutrition meant increased susceptibility to other diseases. The spiral accelerated. Sapiens bands, meanwhile, maintained their numbers even during disease outbreaks. Their larger populations meant some individuals were always recovering, always immune, always able to hunt and gather. They could afford to be sick. Other species couldn't. "We tried separation," Grok Jr. explained to his Sapiens wife, who was desperately trying to understand why her adopted Neanderthal family was dying around her. "Avoided Sapiens camps. But disease travels on traded goods, in shared water, through air at meeting places." The cruelest irony was that attempts at peaceful coexistence accelerated disease transmission. The more species interacted, trading, interbreeding, sharing territories, the faster pathogens spread. Isolation meant starvation. Contact meant contagion. There were no good choices. "Maybe this why we only species left," Asher said quietly, watching a mixed funeral where Sapiens and Neanderthal customs awkwardly combined to honor a child who'd been both. "Not because we stronger or smarter, because we carry death and don't die from it." The Invisible Army marched wherever Sapiens traveled. Into Europe, where Neanderthal populations crashed not from warfare, but from wheezing. Across Asia, where Denisovan mountain strongholds became plague pits. To islands where hobbit populations discovered that the scariest predator was something you couldn't see. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was over. The disease exchanges had run their course. Populations had either developed immunity or died. The survivors were mostly Sapiens, not through any superiority, but through the biological accident of having evolved alongside nastier microbes. "We are walking disease," a Sapiens elder said, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. "We poison everything we touch." "Not poison," his Neanderthal grandson corrected, one of the few hybrids to inherit the right combination of immune genes. "Just different, but different kills as surely as spears." The Invisible Army had conquered continents without a single battle. No monuments would mark their victories. No songs would celebrate their triumphs. Just empty caves where laughter once echoed, abandoned tools whose makers' lungs had filled with fluid, and the guilty survival of those whose bodies carried weapons they never chose to wield. Modern humans celebrate their prehistoric ancestors' triumph over other species. We rarely acknowledge that our greatest weapon wasn't intelligence or tools or social cooperation. It was the common cold. Her name, if she'd had one that could be translated, might have been "Remembers the Stories." But by the time the last Neanderthal woman sat in Gorham's cave in Gibraltar, watching the African coast shimmer in the distance, there was no one left to remember her name, or any Neanderthal names, or the language they were spoken in. She was 43, ancient by any human standard of the time, and she was completely, utterly alone. "I tell you so you know," she said to the waves, "because talking to yourself wasn't crazy when there was literally no one else of your species to talk to. So someone knows we were more than strong, more than hunters, more than the dying ones." She remembered when the cave had housed 40 people, her mother's time, when Neanderthals were still Neanderthals, and not the scattered hybrid remnants trying to breed their way into survival. Back when they had their own stories, their own songs, their own ways of seeing the world that needed no justification or comparison to anyone else's. We sang, she said, her voice cracking from disuse. How long since she'd spoken to another person? Months, years. Time meant nothing when you were the last. Not like sapiens sing, all words and showing off. We sang with the cave, voices and echoes together. Cave remembered our songs, sang them back to us. She demonstrated a low hum that caught the cave's acoustics perfectly, creating harmonics that no single voice could produce. For a moment, the cave was full of Neanderthal voices again. Then silence, and she was alone again. The last decade had been a lesson in compound tragedy. First, the diseases, waves of them, each taking those with the purest Neanderthal blood first. Then, the absorption, the young ones who survived by mating with sapiens, their children looking less and less Neanderthal with each generation until only behaviors remained. A way of napping flint, a preference for certain hunting grounds, ghosts of culture in increasingly sapiens' bodies. "My daughter lives," she said, and it was both true and the cruelest lie possible. Somewhere north, in what would be Spain, her daughter lived in a sapiens band. But she wore sapiens clothes, spoke sapiens language, thought sapiens thoughts. Her children wouldn't even know the word for what their grandmother was. The cave walls held memories. Here, the marks where her father had hung his spears. There, the depression where her mother had ground ochre for 6 decades. The fire pit that had burned continuously for longer than anyone remembered, until the day it didn't because there was no one left to tend it. "We knew the end," she admitted to the ancient ashes. Not sudden knowing, slow knowing, like watching winter come, but lasting forever. She remembered the last gathering, 15 summers ago. 3 bands meeting at the traditional spot, except they weren't bands anymore. Just scattered families, some already half sapiens, pretending things were normal. The young ones had tried to perform the old dances but got the steps wrong. The stories were told, but key parts were forgotten, replaced with sapiens elements that didn't fit. "Like wearing clothes that don't fit," she muttered, "like singing songs in wrong language, like being dead but still walking." The cruelest part was the kindness. The sapiens weren't monsters. Many tried to help, to include, to preserve. But kindness could be its own form of extinction. They'd welcome Neanderthal refugees, teach them sapiens' ways, celebrate when the children survived. Never understanding they were performing euthanasia on an entire culture. "They paint their caves with animals," she said, remembering visiting a sapien site and seeing their art. Beautiful. But why? Animals are outside. Why trap them in stone? We painted ourselves, our hands, our being here. That's what mattered. Her own hands were swollen with arthritis, too painful now to properly nap flint. She'd been reduced to using sapien-style tools, the final indignity. Even her daily survival depended on abandoning Neanderthal ways. The food was running low. Had been for days, maybe weeks. She'd stopped counting. A Neanderthal alone couldn't hunt the old way, couldn't maintain the networks of knowledge about herds and seasons, couldn't even keep a proper fire going with hands that struggled to hold kindling. Could walk to them, she mused, looking north where sapiens' camps sent smoke into the sky. They would take me in, feed me, care for old woman, call it kindness. But she'd made this choice years ago, when the last Neanderthal male in Gibraltar had died. She could have left then, joined the hybrid bands, lived longer. Instead, she'd stayed. Someone had to be the last. Someone had to remember without dilution, without translation, without adaptation. "We were not just the strong ones," she said, beginning what might be her final recitation. We loved, we laughed, we cared for broken ones. We made beauty because beauty mattered. We were people, full people, not almost sapiens, not failed humans. People. The sun was setting, painting the cave red, the color Neanderthals had used before anyone else, the color that meant life and death, and the bridge between. She could see Africa from here on clear days, could see where sapiens had come from to accidentally destroy her world with diseases and ideas and children who survived by forgetting. I am last, she said simply. After me, only stories. Sapien stories about us. Wrong stories, kind stories. Stories that make us what we weren't, but no one left to say, that's not how it was. No one to remember true. She closed her eyes, listening to the cave breathe around her. 40,000 years of Neanderthal presence in this place, ending with one old woman who hurt too much to gather limpets, too proud to accept charity, too stubborn to let her people die unmourned in their own tongue. When sapiens found her 3 months later, they buried her with respect, even honor. They painted her with ochre and left offerings. They told stories about the last Neanderthal, noble and tragic. They got almost everything wrong, but at least they tried to remember. That was more than extinction usually got, and in their trying, they preserved one truth. We were here. We mattered. We were people. Even if no one would ever again truly understand what that meant in Neanderthal terms, the cave sang with emptiness. And then it just was empty. The last echo of the last voice, of the last member of humanity's closest siblings, fading into silence that would last forever. The mammoth matriarch knew the old paths by heart. 3 decades of leading her family through seasonal migrations had worn grooves in her memory deeper than any river channel. But this spring, standing at the edge of what should have been endless grassland, she found only smoke and sapiens. They'd done something unprecedented. Instead of following the herds, waiting for nature's patterns, they'd burned the entire valley. Not a wildfire. Those happened, and the grasslands always recovered. This was systematic, controlled. Line after line of fire set to drive every living thing toward the cliffs. New thinking, Kia's descendant, her great-great-granddaughter, explained to the mixed band of sapiens and hybrid children. Why hunt one mammoth when you can make the land hunt 20 for you? The matriarch trumpeted, calling her family back. But there was nowhere to go. Fire behind, cliffs ahead, humans on both flanks. For the first time in mammoth memory, intelligence had been weaponized against them at landscape scale. This scene was playing out across the world. The megafauna, giants that had ruled every continent since before humans figured out sharp rocks, were discovering that size, strength, and million-year survival records meant nothing against a species that could think 3 moves ahead. In Australia, the last Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a small car, emerged from its burrow to find its world literally on fire. Humans had learned that systematic burning created new growth that attracted herbivores, but they'd gotten too good at it. The burns were too frequent, too widespread. The giants needed old growth forests, not endless cycles of fresh shoots. Big ones can't adapt fast, observed a hunter who'd never seen a living Diprotodon but had heard grandfather's stories. Need too much food, too much space, too much time to make babies. We change land faster than they change themselves. South America was writing its own tragedy. Ground sloths that had survived every predator nature could evolve were meeting their match in persistence hunters who understood physics. Why fight a giant sloth's claws when you could just follow it for 3 days until heat exhaustion did your work for you? They're too big for their own good, a sapiens hunter explained, watching a megatherium collapse from hypothermia. All that muscle makes heat. Can't cool down fast enough. We just walk and wait. But it wasn't just hunting. It was ecosystem engineering on a scale that would make modern humans jealous. Fire stick farming in Australia, canyon drives in Europe, island hopping extinctions in Southeast Asia, each technique perfectly adapted to local conditions, each devastating to megafauna that had evolved for stability. The Neanderthals, in their final generations, watched this transformation with horror and grudging respect. "We hunted with honor," Grok's last descendant said, watching sapiens drive an entire mammoth herd off a cliff. Most would rot, far more meat than anyone could use. One animal, used completely. This is waste. "This is future," his sapiens wife corrected gently. "One big hunt feeds many bands. Many bands means big gathering. Big gathering means shared knowledge. Shared knowledge means better hunting. Circle of plenty." But plenty for humans meant poverty for giants. Each mammoth herd destroyed was a library of migration routes burned. Each ground sloth killed was a seed disperser eliminated. The giants weren't just animals, they were ecosystem engineers whose absence would transform continents. Cave bears, despite their fearsome reputation, were among the first to go. Hibernation sites that had been safe for millennia became traps when humans learned to seal caves and wait for spring starvation to do the killing. An entire species defeated by patience and stone walls. "Doesn't feel like victory," one young hunter admitted, looking at a cave full of bear skeletons. "Feels like emptying." The hobbits on Flores watched their dwarf elephants disappear with bewilderment. They'd hunted them sustainably for 50,000 years. Then new techniques arrived via trading networks, pit traps, fire drives, coordinated ambushes. Within a generation, the elephants were gone. "We didn't mean to," Booty's descendant said, looking at the last elephant bones. "Just got too good at hunting. Forgot to stop." The Denisovans, watching from their mountain refuges, saw the pattern clearly. Each human innovation meant megafauna death. Projectile weapons meant hunting from safety. Fire drives meant landscape-scale harvesting. Boats meant no island was safe. Dogs meant tracking efficiency that no animal could escape. "We are become death," a Denisovan trader said, unconsciously presaging words that wouldn't be spoken for 100,000 years. "Eaters of worlds." The numbers were staggering. Proboscideans, the elephant family, went from dozens of species to just 2. Giant ground sloths, dozens of species to 0. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, giant beavers, massive armadillos, all gone within a few millennia of human contact. "It's not just us," defenders argued. "Climate changing too. Would have died anyway." Maybe. But the timing was suspicious. Megafauna had survived dozens of climate changes. What they couldn't survive was climate change plus humans with new ideas arriving faster than evolution could respond. The last mammoth matriarch, trapped between fire and cliff, made a choice that would have been unthinkable for her ancestors. Instead of protecting the herd at all costs, she turned and charged directly at the human line. Not to escape, she knew that was impossible, but to create chaos, to break the trap, to maybe let some of the younger ones scatter. She died speared 20 times, but 3 juveniles escaped the drive. They'd wander for years, looking for herds that no longer existed, calling for matriarchs who'd never answer, before dying alone and confused in a world that no longer had room for giants. "We won," the hunt leader announced, looking at the pile of mammoth corpses that would feed many but restore none. "Greatest hunt ever sung." "Then why?" asked a child, watching vultures descend on meat that would rot before it could be used. "Does winning feel so empty?" The giants were gone, and with them went the world they'd maintained. Grasslands became forests, forests became grasslands. Seeds that elephants had dispersed for millions of years piled up and rotted. Predators that had evolved to hunt giants starved or adapted to human leftovers. We'd inherited the earth by making it uninhabitable for anything larger than us. The meek hadn't inherited anything. The clever had murdered the mighty and called it progress. Welcome to the Anthropocene. Population. Whatever we allowed to live. Kea was 97 years old, impossibly ancient, kept alive by grandchildren who couldn't bear to lose the last person who remembered the before times. Before there was only one kind of human. Before the giants disappeared. Before winning became a weight heavier than any mammoth tusk. "Tell us about the different peoples, grandmother," little Ao asked. The same question every child had asked for 3 generations. And like always, Kea's eyes went distant, seeing ghosts. "They were people," she began, the same way she always did. Not monsters in stories, not mistakes creator fixed. People. They laughed different, loved different, saw world different, but people. She remembered the last Neanderthal funeral she'd attended 40 winters past. The hybrid community had tried to honor both traditions, sapiens' grave goods for the afterlife journey, Neanderthal positioning facing the sunrise. Nobody was sure they'd gotten either tradition right. Too many keepers of knowledge had died, taking their memories with them. "My grandmother's sister married Neanderthal man," she continued, though she'd told this story so many times it had worn smooth like river stones. Their children were strong, smart, best of both, but also neither, belonged nowhere full way. The children nodded solemnly. They all knew families with the thick body, quick mind combination that marked Neanderthal heritage. But knowing your great-grandfather was different species was strange weight to carry. "Why did others die, grandmother?" Ao's sister asked. "If they were people like us." Kea had spent decades trying to answer that question. The simple answers, disease, climate, competition, were true but felt hollow. Like explaining sunset by saying sun goes down. Accurate but missing the whole sky. "We were weeds," she said finally. "Others were gardens. Gardens beautiful, everything in place, perfect for their spot. But weeds," she gestured at the hardy plants growing through camp. "Weeds grow anywhere. Eat anything. Survive everything. Not better. Just harder to kill." She remembered the last time she'd seen a living Denisovan, 35 winters past. A trader, ancient, carrying medicines no sapiens knew how to make. He'd looked at the thriving sapiens camp with eyes that held no anger, just exhaustion. "You won," he'd said simply. "World is yours now. Try not to break it." Then he'd walked back up his mountain and never came down again. "The guilt," Kea said, surprising herself by speaking thoughts she usually kept buried, "is not that we killed them. Not with spears, not on purpose. Guilt is that we lived by accident, by being worse at everything but surviving." She thought of all the knowledge lost, Neanderthal cave harmonics that no sapien's throat could properly reproduce. Denisovan altitude medicines that worked through mechanisms nobody understood. Erectus wayfinding that had guided them across continents for millions of years. Even hobbit dragoncraft, perfectly adapted to an island ecosystem that no longer existed. "We are like child who inherits library but can't read," she said. "We have whole world but lost instructions for using it right." The irony cut deep. Sapiens had survived through flexibility, through adapting faster than evolution allowed. But in winning, they'd created a world that required the very specializations they'd defeated. Who knew ice when the ice masters were gone? Who understood giants when the giant hunters had vanished? Who could read the deep patterns when the pattern keepers had died? "Sometimes I dream them," Kea admitted, "all the peoples together at the last waterhole. They look at us, not angry, just disappointed, like parents watching child break favorite pot. Sad for child who now has no pot. The children were quiet. This wasn't how the story usually went. Usually, grandmother talked about the clever innovations, the brave explorations, the triumph of human spirit. This was different, heavier. "Are we bad, grandmother?" Io asked in a small voice. "No," Kea said firmly. "We are what we are. Weeds don't choose to choke gardens. Rain doesn't choose to flood. We survived because that's what life does. It survives. But..." She paused, looking at the diverse faces around her, some showing Neanderthal thickness, others the lean build of pure sapiens, a few with features that whispered of Denisovan heritage. All human now, all carrying ghosts in their cells. "But we carry responsibility now. We are only ones left to remember all peoples, to learn from all ways, to honor the gone by living better." She thought of the empty world they'd inherited, the mammoth highways now forests, the giant sloth gardens now tangles, the cave bear homes now echoing human voices, every absence a reminder of what thoughtless success cost. "When I die," she said, causing grandchildren to protest reflexively, "you must remember this. We won by accident. We inherited by default. We are not chosen. We are what's left. And what's left must be enough to honor what's gone." That night, Kea dreamed the dream again. All the peoples at the waterhole, but this time they weren't disappointed. They were waiting, patient as only the dead can be, waiting for their accidental inheritors to become worthy of the empty world they'd won. She woke knowing she wouldn't see another spring, but she'd told the story, planted the guilt like seeds. Maybe it would grow into wisdom. Maybe her great-great-grandchildren would find ways to fill some of the absences their survival had created. Or maybe they'd just inherit the guilt along with the world, passing both down forever, the price of being the only ones left to remember what a full world looked like. Either way, the story would continue. The last story, the only story. The story of those who survived to tell stories about those who didn't. The last gathering of all the peoples happened in dreams now. Io, great-granddaughter of memories, stood at the ancient waterhole where 7 species had once drunk together. But she stood alone, except for shadows only she could see. It had been 20 winters since the last confirmed non-sapiens human died. An old woman on a distant island who might have been part Denisovan, part something else, but definitely the last of whatever mixture she was. The world now held only one kind of human. Homo sapiens, alone at last. "We used to think alone meant safe," Ao said to the assembled sapiens bands who'd come for this memorial gathering. "No competition, no other humans to fight for resources, just us everywhere, forever." She paused, looking at the 1,000 faces. More humans in one place than had existed in some entire species. All sapiens, all victorious, all somehow diminished by their solitary success. But alone also means alone with our mistakes. Alone with consequences. Alone with no one else to blame when things go wrong. The litany of absences had grown beyond other humans. The world they'd inherited was emptying at accelerating pace. The last mammoths were gone. Cave bears, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, all vanished into bone and regret. Even smaller creatures were disappearing as humans spread into every niche, every island, every possible habitat. "My great-great-grandmother remembered when different humans brought different wisdom," Ao continued. "Neanderthals who knew cold, Denisovans who knew height. Each people had piece of survival puzzle. Now we have all pieces but no picture to follow." The irony was bitter as winter wind. Sapiens had survived through diversity, genetic, cultural, technological, but their survival had eliminated diversity itself. one species, one basic culture with minor variations, one way of seeing the world reflected endlessly in every human face. We tell ourselves we're diverse, a young man called out. Different bands, different customs. We're not all same. No, Io agreed, but we're all same species. All think with sapiens' brains. All see with sapiens' eyes. When Neanderthal looked at cave, they saw something we'll never understand. When Denisovan breathed mountain air, they felt something we can't feel. We have whole world but only one way of knowing it. She thought of the hybrid children, the ones carrying ghost genetics from other species. They were living monuments to what had been lost. A child with Neanderthal strength, but sapiens ambition. Another with Denisovan lungs but lowland preferences. Mixing without understanding, like cooking with ingredients you couldn't name. The true price, she said, isn't that we're alone. It's that we don't know what we're missing, like person born blind, trying to understand color from descriptions. We can list what others did, but not feel how they experienced doing it. The gathering fell silent. Around them the empty world echoed with absences. No mammoth trumpets, no giant sloth calls, no cave bear roars. Even the human voices were monotone now. All sapiens variants of the same basic sounds. The symphony had become a solo act. So, what do we do? A child asked, the eternal question of the inheritors. Io looked at the waterhole, imagining it full again. 7 species jostling for position. The careful negotiations of space. The wary respect between different kinds of human. The richness of multiple solutions to survival's puzzles. We remember, she said finally, not just that they existed, but that existence could be different. We carry their genes, their tools, their stories. We're not them, can never be them, but we're touched by them, changed by them. She pulled out a shell necklace, design passed down from the first sapiens fashion, but made with techniques learned from Neanderthals, strung with methods adapted from Denisovans, telling stories that mixed all traditions into something new. We're alone, she said, but we're alone with memories, alone with responsibilities, alone with the knowledge that being only doesn't mean being best, just being last. The sun set over the waterhole, painting shadows of species that would never drink there again. But in the flames of the evening fires, in the stories told to children, in the dreams of the guilty survivors, the ghosts gathered still. Neanderthal strength, Denisovan adaptation, Erectus endurance, Hobbit ingenuity, all the ways of being human that weren't sapiens but were undeniably human. The world is ours, Io concluded. We won by outlasting, by adapting faster, by carrying diseases and ideas that spread like wildfire. We won by accident and persistence and the random luck of evolution. But winning means inheriting everything, the beauty and the emptiness, the possibilities and the absences. She looked at her people, the only people now, forever. We are alone at last. May we be worthy of the solitude we've created. May we fill some fraction of what we've emptied. May we remember that being the only ones left doesn't make us the best, just the responsible. The gathering dispersed, each band returning to territories that once held different species, carrying shells and stones and stories, carrying genes that whispered of other ways, carrying the endless burden of being the sole inheritors of a world built for diversity, Homo sapiens, wise humans, alone at last with their wisdom and their emptiness, trying to be enough for a world that had thrived on many. The price of victory was everything they'd defeated. The prize was an empty throne in an echoing palace, ruling subjects who all shared the same face in the mirror. They'd won evolution's lottery, Now they had to figure out what to do with the winnings. Forever. Alone. The last human species stood at the waterhole, seeing only their own reflection multiplied infinitely. They'd achieved what no species had before: total dominance, complete solitude, absolute victory. It tasted like ashes. It echoed like extinction. It stretched ahead like a road with no turnings, no surprises, no others to meet along the way. Just Homo sapiens, wise and alone, inheriting the earth they'd accidentally emptied in their triumphant stumble toward tomorrow. The story of the 7 species had become the story of one, and that one would spend the rest of history wondering what the other 6 would have done differently. Alone at last. The price paid in full. The future uncertain as fog, but certainly, utterly, eternally human in only one way. The waterhole reflected stars in a single species drinking deeply from the well of their solitary victory.